Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. April had just turned cold again when I got the call about the house. My childhood home in Millbridge, Vermont, had been sitting empty for 18 months since Dad passed, and the lawyer said it was time to either sell or commit to the property taxes. I'd been avoiding it, honestly. The place held too many memories, and not all of them were the kind you want to revisit. But my apartment lease in Boston was ending, and I figured 2 weeks in Vermont wouldn't kill me. I could sort through decades of accumulated stuff, get the house ready for listing, and maybe find some closure. The drive up through New Hampshire felt longer than I remembered. The mountains pressing in on both sides of the highway, still patched with dirty snow even though it was late March. Millbridge hadn't changed much. Population 3,200, one stoplight, 3 churches, and a general store that doubled as the post office. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do. The house looked smaller than it did in my memories. The white paint had gone gray in patches, and the apple orchard behind the property had grown wild, branches tangled together like arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky. Dad had stopped maintaining it after Mom died in 2009. I'd been away at college then, and when I came back for the funeral, the orchard was already starting its slow surrender to nature. Now it looked like something out of a fairy tale, the kind that doesn't end well. I'd hired a local kid, Andrew Brennan, to help me haul stuff to the dump. His mom had been friends with my mom back in high school, and he needed money for community college. He showed up on Monday morning in a pickup truck that sounded like it was held together by prayer and duct tape. We started in the attic, where Dad had stored everything he couldn't bear to throw away. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old tax returns, my school projects from elementary school. It was going to be a long 2 weeks. The photo fell out of a water-damaged cardboard box labeled Kitchen Misk in Mom's handwriting. I almost missed it, would have if the corner hadn't caught the light just right. It was a Polaroid. The colors faded to that weird orange-yellow tint they get after a few decades. 5 teenage girls stood in a line, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They were dressed in that unmistakable late 80s style. All big hair and acid-wash denim and neon windbreakers. I recognized Mom immediately. Second from the left, her dark hair permed into oblivion. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17. The photo had been taken in front of our orchard. I could see the neat rows of apple trees in the background before they'd gone wild. Someone had written on the white border at the bottom in blue pen, "Summer 1987, best friends forever." I flipped it over. On the back, in different handwriting, were 5 names: Diane, Julie, Mom's name, Vanessa, and Christine. I'd never seen this photo before. Mom had hardly any pictures from her teenage years, said she didn't like having her photo taken back then. But here she was, looking genuinely happy, surrounded by girls I'd never heard her mention. I showed it to Andrew, who was wrestling with a box of old National Geographic magazines. He glanced at it and shrugged. "Looks like your mom had friends," he said. "That's the orchard, right?" Before it went crazy. I asked if he recognized any of the other girls, if their families still lived in town. He squinted at the photo, then pointed to the girl on the far right, a blonde with a prominent gap between her front teeth. That might be Christine Holloway. "There's still a Holloway family on Birch Road, but I don't know if they're related." He handed the photo back to me and went back to the magazines. Something about it bothered me, though, the way it had been tucked away in a random box, like someone had hidden it deliberately. That night after Andrew left, I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of Dad's old whiskey and stared at those 5 smiling faces. Mom's smile looked different than I remembered it, more open, less weighted down by whatever had made her so quiet in her later years. The next morning, I drove into town with the photo in my jacket pocket. The Millbridge Public Library was in the same building as the town hall, a brick structure that smelled like old paper and floor wax. Mrs. Galloway, the librarian who'd been there since before I was born, looked up from her desk with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when I walked in. I told her I was doing some family history research, that I'd found an old photo of my mom and wanted to learn more about her friends. She got very still when I showed her the picture. Her finger traced over the faces, lingering on each one. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her it had been in a box in the attic. She handed it back quickly, like it had burned her. "Those girls," she said, then stopped. "Most of them moved away a long time ago. You know how it is with small towns? People leave." But there was something in the way she said it, something rehearsed, like she'd told this story before and had gotten good at making it sound casual. I pressed her, asked specifically about each name. Mrs. Galloway's jaw tightened. "Diane moved to California in 1988. Julie, I think she went to New York. Vanessa, maybe Florida. Christine stayed the longest, but she left too. Must have been 1989 or 1990. Every answer came out too quickly, too prepared. I asked if she had yearbooks from that era. Maybe I could find more information about them. She told me the yearbooks from those years had been damaged in a flood in the basement back in 2003. Most of them were thrown out. Convenient, I thought, but didn't say. I thanked her and left, but as I reached the door, she called out, "Your mother wouldn't want you digging into this." I turned around. "Into what?" She just shook her head and went back to her computer, fingers trembling slightly as they found the keyboard. Outside, I sat in my car for a long time, engine running, heat blasting. The whole conversation felt wrong. People don't react like that to a simple question about old high school friends, not unless there's something to hide. I spent the rest of that day at the town hall, going through old newspaper archives on microfiche. The Millbridge Gazette was a weekly paper, mostly local sports and town council meetings, but I figured disappearances would make the news. I searched every issue from 1987 through 1992. Nothing. Not a single article about missing girls, runaways, or disappearances. There were obituaries, sure, but none for anyone matching those names or ages. What I did find was strange in its absence. There were gaps in the papers, issues that should have existed but didn't. July 1987 was missing. October 1988 had 3 consecutive weeks gone. Spring of 1989, another gap. I asked the clerk about it, a young guy who clearly didn't care much about his job. He said sometimes issues got damaged or lost over the years, it happens, but the pattern felt deliberate. Those weren't random gaps. I drove to the address Andrew had mentioned, the Holloway place on Birch Road. It was a small ranch house with peeling yellow paint and a yard full of cars in various states of disrepair. An older man answered the door, maybe in his 70s, with suspicious eyes and a Boston Red Sox cap pulled low. I introduced myself, said I was looking for information about Christine Holloway. His face changed instantly, not sad, but angry. "You a reporter?" he asked, his hand tightening on the doorframe. I told him no, that I was just trying to learn about my mom's old friends. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Christine ran away in 1989. Took off in the middle of the night, didn't leave a note, nothing. Police said she was 18, free to go where she wanted. End of story." But his voice cracked when he said her name. I asked if he'd ever heard from her after she left. He shook his head. "Not a word in 36 years. Her mother died thinking Christine hated us. You want to know the truth? The truth is this town let her disappear and nobody gave a damn." He started to close the door, then stopped. "Your uncle was the police chief back then, Harold Weaver. He told us Christine was a troubled girl, that she'd probably gone to find herself in some city somewhere. He said we should let it go, that she'd come back when she was ready. We believed him." The door shut in my face before I could respond. Uncle Harold. Mom's older brother, the one who died of a heart attack when I was 12. I barely remembered him, just a stern man in a uniform who showed up at family holidays and didn't smile much. When I got back to the house, Andrew was loading broken furniture into his truck. I asked him if he knew anything about girls disappearing in the late 80s. He stopped mid-lift, an old chair suspended in his arms. "My mom mentioned something once," he said slowly. She said there were some girls who left town back when she was in high school. But she got really weird when I asked about it, told me it was ancient history and I should focus on my own life. He set the chair down. Why are you asking? I showed him the photo again, explained what I'd learned. He looked uncomfortable. Look, I need this job, but I don't want to get involved in something that's going to piss off the whole town. My family lives here. I told him I understood, that he didn't have to help me with this part. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. There's an old storage unit out by Route 7. Police department used to keep evidence there before they built the new station. My uncle works maintenance for the facility. He said most of the old units haven't been touched in decades. If your uncle kept anything, it might still be there. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mom, about how quiet she'd been my whole life, how she never talked about her childhood or her friends, how she'd sometimes stare out at the orchard with this look on her face, like she was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. I'd always assumed she was just sad about getting older, about how time changes things. But now I wondered if she'd been carrying something heavier. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went down to the kitchen. The house made different sounds at night, creaks and groans I'd forgotten about. I made coffee and sat at the table with my laptop, searching for any information I could find about the other girls. Diane, Julie, Vanessa. Nothing came up. No social media profiles, no obituaries, no marriage records, nothing. It was like they'd been erased. 5 girls in one photo, and 4 of them had vanished without leaving a single digital footprint. In a world where everyone exists online in some form, that kind of absence isn't accidental. Somebody had worked very hard to make sure these girls stayed gone, at least on paper. I thought about Uncle Harold, about his position of authority, about how easy it would be for a small-town police chief to make inconvenient questions disappear along with inconvenient people. The storage facility was a depressing row of metal units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place that rents month to month and doesn't ask questions. Andrew's uncle, a heavy-set man named Don with nicotine-stained fingers, met me there on Wednesday morning. I'd told him I was looking for some of my uncle's old police files for a family history project. He didn't seem to care either way. Unit 23, he said, handing me a key that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Haven't seen anyone access that one since before I started working here, and that was 2007. You find anything valuable? The department technically still owns it. The unit smelled like mildew and rust when I rolled up the door. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, most of them labeled with case numbers and dates. I started pulling them down, searching for anything from 1987 to 1990. Most of it was routine stuff, traffic violations, petty theft reports, one domestic dispute case. Then, in a box marked MISC 1988-1989, I found a folder that made my hands go numb. It was labeled Informal Investigations in Uncle Harold's handwriting. Inside were newspaper clippings from other states, articles about unidentified remains found in rural areas. He'd circled certain details in red pen, details about age, gender, approximate time of death. There were also Polaroids, dozens of them, taken in the orchard behind my house. They showed disturbed earth, areas where the ground had clearly been dug up and refilled. Each photo had a date written on the back: July 1987, October 1988, April 1989, May 1989. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the concrete floor. The dates matched the gaps in the newspaper archives. They matched the timeline of when the girls supposedly ran away. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and took pictures of everything in that folder. Every article, every photo, every note. There was a handwritten log too, Uncle Harold's daily notes. Most entries were mundane, but scattered throughout were lines that made my stomach turn. Spoke with Holloway family again. They're accepting the runaway story. Diane's parents finally stopped calling. Convincing people these girls wanted to leave is easier than I thought. Small-town prejudices work in my favor. And then, near the end of the log, one entry that broke something inside me. Spoke to my sister today. She knows, she's always known. But she won't say anything. Family protects family, even when it shouldn't. My mother had known. She'd known what happened to her friends, and she'd stayed silent for the rest of her life, carrying that weight alone because her brother was a murderer and she couldn't bring herself to turn him in. I drove straight to the Vermont State Police Barracks in Rutland, 40 minutes away, with the folder on my passenger seat. I didn't trust anyone in Millbridge. The detective I spoke with, a woman named Carver, listened to everything without interrupting. When I showed her the photos and the log, her expression went from skeptical to grave. She made calls, and within hours, a forensics team was on its way to my property. They spent 3 days searching the orchard with ground-penetrating radar. They found 4 sets of remains buried in shallow graves exactly where Uncle Harold's photos indicated: Diane, Julie, Vanessa, and Christine. The 5th girl in the photo, my mother, had been the sole survivor, the one who got away because she was his sister. And even monsters sometimes have limits. The town exploded with the news. Some people were horrified, others were angry that I'd dug up the past. Mrs. Galloway refused to speak to anyone. Christine's father called me, sobbing, saying he'd waited 36 years to know what happened to his daughter, and thanking me for giving him that closure, even though it came with such terrible truth. I sold the house within a month. Couldn't stand to be there anymore. The orchard was excavated completely, turned into a memorial garden for the victims. Before I left Vermont for good, I went back one last time and stood where that photo had been taken in 1987. 5 girls smiling at the camera, none of them knowing that 4 would be dead within 2 years, and the 5th would spend the rest of her life drowning in guilt and silence. I understood now why Mom had been so quiet, why she never wanted to talk about her past, why she'd look at the orchard with that haunted expression. She'd been looking at their graves, living above the evidence of her brother's crimes, knowing the truth but never speaking it, protecting a monster because he was family. I'll never know if she stayed silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty, and maybe it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that those 4 girls finally got to go home to their families, even if it was 3 decades too late. I still have that photo, tucked away in a drawer I rarely open. Sometimes I take it out and look at those 5 faces, all that youth and possibility, and I think about how one person's evil can ripple through generations, destroying not just the victims but everyone connected to them. The house sold to a family from Massachusetts who had no idea about its history. I didn't tell them. Maybe that makes me like my mother, keeping secrets to protect people from ugly truths. Or maybe some stories need to be buried along with the dead. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that I'll never go back to Millbridge, and every time I see an apple orchard, I drive past it as fast as I can. People always ask why I became a journalist, and I usually give them some noble answer about truth and accountability. The real reason is simpler and darker than that. It started the day I came home to Cypress Bend, Louisiana to pack up my father's house after his funeral. Dad had been the town clerk for 40 years before retiring in 2014, and he'd kept everything. Every document, every file, every scrap of paper that passed through the municipal building ended up in our garage or attic. My older sister Kathleen refused to deal with it, said she had 3 kids and a husband to worry about, so the job fell to me. I'd just turned 36 the week before Dad died. No wife, no kids, just a decent job at a newspaper in Atlanta covering city council meetings and zoning disputes, the kind of stories that put people to sleep. I took a month's leave and drove the 9 hours back to the place I'd spent my whole childhood trying to escape. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do. It sat on Magnolia Avenue, a street that used to be nice before the chemical plant laid off half the town in 2008. Dad's Toyota was still in the driveway, covered in that yellow pollen that coats everything in Louisiana during spring. It was a Saturday in May, humid as hell, and the cicadas were already screaming in the oak trees. I'd been dreading this for weeks. Not just because of the grief, but because I knew what waited inside. Dad had been a hoarder of the bureaucratic kind. The living room was stacked with banker's boxes, the hallway lined with filing cabinets, the spare bedroom converted into what he called his archive. Mom had left him over it back when I was in college, said she couldn't live in a museum anymore. She'd remarried and moved to Florida, sent flowers to the funeral but didn't come. I couldn't blame her. The house smelled like old paper and the lemon cleaner Dad used obsessively, trying to keep the mold at bay. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag, looking at the mountain of work ahead, and seriously considered just hiring an estate sale company to deal with all of it. I started in the garage because it seemed the least personal. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, labeled in Dad's careful block letters. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Tax records, water bills from 1987, permits for shed construction, complaints about barking dogs, boring, mundane stuff that should have been thrown out decades ago. I worked methodically, creating piles for trash, recycling, and the maybe 5% worth keeping. By noon, I was covered in dust and spider webs, my back aching from bending over boxes. I'd filled 6 garbage bags and barely made a dent. That's when I found them, pushed way back in the corner behind a rusted lawnmower and some old paint cans. 4 boxes, sealed with packing tape that had gone brown and brittle with age. The labels were different from Dad's usual style, written in black marker, hurried and uneven. Flood Relief 93, do not open. The thing is, I remembered 1993. I was 7 years old when the flood hit. School got canceled for 2 weeks, and we had to stay with my aunt in Baton Rouge because water came up to our porch steps. It was the biggest disaster in Cypress Bend's history, the whole downtown underwater, people living in the high school gymnasium for months. But what struck me standing in that garage was the second part of the label. Why would Dad write, "Do not open," on relief documents? I pulled one of the boxes out, the cardboard soft with moisture damage despite being sealed. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to Dad's workbench and grabbed a utility knife from the pegboard. My journalist instincts were kicking in now, that familiar buzz I got when something didn't add up. I cut through the tape, and the smell hit me first. Old paper, but also something else, something chemical and wrong. Inside were files, hundreds of them, organized with the same precision Dad brought to everything. But these weren't relief documents. They were missing persons reports. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60 in just this one box. Each form was the official kind, the Louisiana State Police template with the seal at the top. But someone had stamped them all with red ink. Not processed. I pulled one out at random. A woman named Gloria Thibodeau, 41 years old, last seen at her home on Riverside Court on Wednesday, June 9, 1993. The report was filed by her sister on June 15th. There was a Polaroid photo paperclipped to the form, showing a smiling woman with dark curly hair standing in front of a small yellow house. I grabbed another file. James Ortega, 19, last seen leaving his job at the marina on the same date, June 9th. Another photo, a skinny kid with a work uniform and a shy smile. Then another, Carolyn Dufresne and her 2 daughters, ages 8 and 11. All last seen June 9th, 1993. All reported missing in the days after. All stamped, not processed. My heart started pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the garage heat. June 9th, 1993, was the day the levee broke. I remembered because it was my grandmother's birthday, and we were supposed to have cake that evening, but never did because the sirens started going off around 3 in the afternoon. The Riverside neighborhood got hit first and worst, the water coming in so fast that people barely had time to get to their roofs. The news said it was 20 feet deep in some places. I grabbed my phone and started Googling, pulling up the old newspaper archives from the Cypress Bend Chronicle. The official death toll from the flood was listed as 7 people. 7. I had at least 30 missing persons reports in my hands from just one box, and there were 3 more boxes in that corner. I started pulling files faster, my hands getting that tremble you get when you're onto something big. Every single report had the same date, June 9th, 1993. Every single person was from Riverside, and every single form had that red stamp. Someone had deliberately not processed these reports. Someone had made these people disappear from the official record. I spent the next 4 hours going through all 4 boxes. By the time I finished, I'd counted 147 missing persons reports. 147 people who vanished the day of the flood, all from the same neighborhood, all officially erased. The files included everything you'd expect: detailed descriptions, last known locations, family contacts, even some personal effects that had been turned in. A wallet, a set of house keys, a child's stuffed rabbit, water-stained and falling apart. Someone had taken these reports seriously enough to collect evidence, but then buried them. I found something else too, tucked into the bottom of the last box. A manila envelope marked "Engineering Survey, Confidential." Inside were blueprints of the levee system, covered in notations and calculations in different handwriting. Yellow sticky notes were attached to several pages, and one note made my stomach turn. It was dated June 8, 1993, the day before the flood. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Charges placed as requested. Primary breach point north sector will direct flow to Riverside. Detonation window 2:04 p.m. Wednesday. God forgive us. I sat down hard on Dad's workbench stool, my legs suddenly unreliable. Someone had blown the levee on purpose. They deliberately flooded Riverside, and my father had known about it. The evidence was in his garage, hidden for 31 years. I thought about Dad's last few months, how he'd gotten quiet and withdrawn, how he'd stopped going to church even though he'd been an usher for 20 years, how he'd called me 3 times in the weeks before his heart attack, leaving rambling messages about needing to tell me something important. But I'd been busy with a story deadline and kept saying I'd call him back later. I never did. Now he was gone, and I was holding proof of mass murder. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for anything about Riverside neighborhood. What I found made everything worse. After the flood, the land had been declared unusable, too damaged to rebuild. The entire neighborhood, 43 acres, had been sold to a development company for next to nothing. That company was owned by the Prudhomme family. Everyone in Cypress Bend knew the Prudhommes. They owned half the parish, had for generations. Sugarcane plantations, timber operations, commercial real estate. The family estate sat on a hill overlooking the river, a white mansion with columns that had been there since before the Civil War. In 1993, the patriarch was Jean-Paul Prudhomme, and according to the property records I was pulling up, his holdings had been directly upstream from Riverside. If the levee had broken naturally where it was supposed to, the water would have flooded his processing plant and 5,000 acres of prime agricultural land. But by breaching it at the north sector instead, the water got diverted away from his property and straight into Riverside, a poor neighborhood where most people rented, where nobody had the money or connections to fight back. I found a photo from the Chronicle dated June 11, 1993, showing Jean-Paul touring the flood damage with the governor. He looked concerned in that practiced way rich people do, wearing rubber boots that probably cost more than most people's rent. The caption mentioned his generous donation to the relief fund. Blood money. I couldn't stay in that garage anymore. I loaded all 4 boxes into my car, then went back for the engineering documents. It was almost 7 in the evening, the sun setting orange and angry through the humidity. I sat in my car with the air conditioning blasting, trying to figure out what to do next. The smart move would be to call the FBI, hand everything over, let the professionals handle it. But I'd been a journalist long enough to know how these things went. The Prudhommes had money, real money, the kind that bought lawyers and politicians and made evidence disappear. Jean-Paul was dead now, had been for a decade, but his son Olivier ran the family business and sat on every important board in the parish. One phone call from him and this whole thing could get buried again, just like Dad had buried it. No, I needed to document everything first, build an airtight case, and then go public in a way that couldn't be ignored. I drove to the one place in Cypress Bend I knew would have the records I needed, the parish courthouse. The building was closed, but I'd grown up in this town and knew things tourists didn't. The records room had a separate entrance in the back, and the night security guard was Billy Fontaine, who'd been 2 grades ahead of me in school. I knocked on the maintenance door until he opened it, looking annoyed until he recognized me. We talked for 10 minutes about Dad's funeral, about his own father's diabetes, about how the town wasn't what it used to be. Then I told him I needed to look at some property records for a story I was writing, and he let me in without asking questions. Small town courtesy, the kind that can save you or destroy you depending on who's watching. I spent 3 hours in that records room, photographing everything: deeds, tax assessments, water management reports, environmental surveys. I found the original engineering specifications for the levee, which showed the north sector was actually reinforced concrete, the strongest point in the entire system. For it to fail there naturally would have been nearly impossible. I found insurance claims too, dozens of them, all denied because flood insurance didn't cover acts of God back then. People lost everything and got nothing. The last thing I found was a memo dated June 15, 1993, from the Parish Emergency Management Office to all local law enforcement. It ordered them to halt processing of any missing persons reports from Riverside until further notice, citing the need to avoid premature panic and allow time for thorough rescue operations. The memo was signed by the emergency coordinator, a man named Frank Boudreau, but at the bottom was a handwritten note, per Prud'homme request. That's when I understood what Dad had done. He hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He'd been the one person who'd refused to destroy the evidence. Everyone else had followed orders, but Dad had kept those reports, hidden them, preserved them for 31 years until someone could do something about it. He'd tried to tell me before he died, and I'd been too busy to listen. I left the courthouse at midnight with my phone full of documentation and a plan forming in my head. I couldn't trust the local police. Half of them probably owed their jobs to Prud'homme donations. But I had friends at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and I had enough evidence to make this national news. I drove back to Dad's house, uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services, and sent encrypted files to 2 journalist colleagues with instructions to publish if anything happened to me. Then I finally allowed myself to feel it, the weight of what I'd discovered, and I cried for the first time since Dad's funeral. The story broke 6 days later. I'd spent that time tracking down survivors, people who'd lost family members in Riverside and never got answers. Most had moved away, scattered across Louisiana and beyond, but they all remembered. They remembered filing reports that went nowhere, remembered being told their loved ones probably just left town, remembered the way people stopped asking questions when the Prud'homme name came up. I interviewed 23 people, recorded every conversation, documented every detail. When the Times-Picayune published the first article, it included photographs of the missing persons reports, scans of the engineering documents, and testimony from the survivors. The headline read, "Cypress Bend Flood of '93. New evidence suggests deliberate levee breach killed over 140. Within hours, every major news outlet in the country picked it up. CNN, NBC, The Washington Post. By the end of the week, the FBI had opened an investigation, and the Louisiana Attorney General announced a special task force. Olivier Prud'homme released a statement calling the allegations baseless and defamatory, but his lawyers couldn't explain away the documents. The physical evidence was too damning, too specific, too real. 3 months later, they found the bodies. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the old Riverside neighborhood, which was now a shopping center and parking lot, revealed multiple unmarked burial sites. The excavation took weeks, but they eventually recovered remains of 68 people, including children. DNA testing confirmed their identities matched names from Dad's missing persons reports. The medical examiner determined most had drowned, but some showed signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting they'd been caught in the initial blast when the levee was breached. Olivier Prud'homme was indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal evidence. He maintained his father had acted alone, but financial records showed he'd paid off 3 parish officials as recently as 2023 to keep the Riverside files sealed. Frank Boudreau, the old emergency coordinator, confessed in exchange for immunity. He confirmed Jean-Paul Prudhomme had ordered the levee breach and paid the demolition crew $500,000 in cash. The crew members were dead now, conveniently all of natural causes over the past decade. But Boudreau's testimony was enough. The trial starts next month, and I'll be there to cover every minute of it. I still live in Cypress Bend now. Quit my job in Atlanta and took a position at the Chronicle, the same paper that once published puff pieces about Jean-Paul's charity work. They made me investigative editor, gave me full freedom to dig into whatever stories the town tried to bury. Kathleen speaks to me again, said she's proud of what I did, even if it means the family name is complicated around here. Some people treat me like a hero, others won't make eye contact at the grocery store. The Prudhommes still have friends, still have money, still have power, but they don't have silence anymore. Dad's house sold last month, and I used part of the money to help fund a memorial for the Riverside victims. It's a simple granite wall with all 147 names engraved, located on the only piece of the old neighborhood that wasn't developed, a small park by the river. At the dedication ceremony, survivors came from all over the country. They touched the names, cried, finally had a place to grieve. I think about Dad standing in that garage looking at those boxes year after year, carrying the weight of what he knew and couldn't fix. He did what he could with what he had, and in the end, that was enough. The truth came out, even if it took 31 years and his death to make it happen. Sometimes justice is just someone refusing to let the world forget. Honestly, I never thought I'd be the person posting something like this online, but I need to get it out somewhere because talking about it in person makes me feel sick all over again. My wife Claire and I got married in June 2014, right after I finished my teaching degree. We were broke as hell, living off her salary as a dental hygienist while I scrambled for substitute teaching gigs around the county. When we found that rental house on the edge of Fairmont, Pennsylvania, it felt like we'd won the lottery. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a little backyard for the dog we planned to get someday, all for $800 a month. The landlord, this guy named Vincent Marsh, seemed normal enough when we met him at the property. Mid-50s, thinning gray hair, wore these thick-framed glasses that made his eyes look huge. He smiled a lot, maybe too much, but we figured he was just eager to rent the place after it sat empty for 3 months. We moved in on a Saturday in late July, and I remember thinking the house had good bones despite the outdated wallpaper and the weird, musty smell in the hallway closet. Claire was already planning which walls we'd repaint, talking about hanging curtains in the bedroom to block out the streetlight that shone directly through our window at night. That first week felt like playing house, you know. We'd order pizza and eat it on the floor, because our furniture hadn't arrived yet, making plans about the life we were going to build there. Vincent stopped by twice that week, once to fix a leaky faucet and another time to check the furnace before winter, he said. Both times he lingered longer than necessary, asking questions about our schedules, when we'd be home, whether we were light sleepers. Claire mentioned later that she thought it was weird how he kept glancing toward our bedroom door, but I brushed it off. Landlords are nosy, right? They want to make sure you're not trashing their property. I wish I'd paid more attention to the way his hands trembled when he handed me his business card, or how he wrote his personal cell number on the back in pen that smudged across the paper like he'd been sweating. It was Claire who noticed the first hole. We'd been living there almost 3 weeks when she decided to rearrange the bedroom furniture. She wanted the bed against the far wall instead of under the window, thought it would help us sleep better without that streetlight blazing into our faces every night. When we pushed the dresser away from the corner, there it was, right at eye level if you were standing in the hallway outside. A perfectly round hole, maybe half an inch across, drilled straight through the drywall. The edges were smooth, deliberate, and when I put my eye up to it, I could see directly into our bedroom, a clear view of where our bed had been positioned for the past 3 weeks. My throat got tight. Claire grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging in hard enough to leave marks. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably just a minute, both of us trying to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant hung something heavy. Maybe there was some electrical work done, but the hole was too clean, too purposeful, and it was aimed at exactly the right height and angle. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started checking the other walls, moving furniture, pulling down the few pictures we'd hung. We found 2 more in the bedroom alone. One behind the nightstand on Claire's side, another near the closet that gave a perfect view of where she changed clothes every morning before work. The panic really set in when we checked the bathroom. I had to move the towel rack to find it, but there it was. Another hole drilled through the wall that separated the bathroom from the utility closet in the hallway. This one was positioned to see directly into the shower. Claire started crying, the kind of crying where you can't catch your breath, and I felt this rage building in my chest that made my vision blur at the edges. We'd been showering there for 3 weeks. We'd been sleeping there, changing there, doing everything married people do in the privacy of their own home. I wanted to punch something, wanted to drive straight to Vincent's house and drag him out by his collar, but Claire begged me to call the police first. She was shaking so badly I had to dial the number for her. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what we'd found, but the words came out jumbled and probably didn't make much sense. The dispatcher kept asking if we were in immediate danger, if someone was in the house right now, and I kept saying no, but yes. Someone had been watching us. Someone had violated us in a way I couldn't even articulate. They said they'd send an officer over within the hour. That hour felt like a decade. While we waited, I couldn't just sit there. I went into the hallway closet, the one with that musty smell we'd never bothered investigating, and started pulling out the boxes of Christmas decorations and old paint cans the previous tenant had left behind. At the back of the closet, behind a sheet of plywood leaning against the wall, I found the access panel to the crawl space above the first floor. The panel wasn't screwed in like it should have been. It just lifted right off. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, boosted myself up, and shone the flashlight into the darkness above. What I saw made my stomach turn inside out. There were wires everywhere, thin black cables running along the ceiling joists like veins, all converging toward a central point above our bedroom. I followed them with the flashlight beam and found a small metal box bolted to a beam, about the size of a lunchbox, with more wires feeding into it from different directions. Some of the cables disappeared into holes drilled down through the ceiling, positioned exactly where we'd found the holes in the walls below. I'm not an electrician, but I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't original wiring. This was new, maybe a few months old based on how clean the plastic coating looked. Claire called up to me asking what I'd found, but I couldn't form words. I just climbed down and showed her the pictures I'd taken on my phone. Her face went completely white. The officer who showed up was young, couldn't have been more than a year or 2 out of the academy. His name was Officer Reynolds, and he had this uncomfortable expression like he'd been expecting a noise complaint, not whatever mess we were describing. He looked at the holes, took some pictures with the department camera, then asked if he could see the crawl space. I took him up there, and I watched his expression change from skeptical to deeply concerned as he swept his own flashlight across the wiring. He made a phone call, spoke in that clipped cop voice they use on radios, and within 20 minutes 2 detectives showed up. Detective Brenner was older, maybe 50, with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. His partner was a woman named Detective Huang, sharp and focused, already pulling on latex gloves before she'd even climbed into the crawl space. They spent 45 minutes up there talking in low voices we couldn't quite hear, occasionally asking us questions through the opening. Had we touched anything? Had we noticed anyone unusual around the property? Did the landlord have keys? That last question hit different. Of course he had keys. He was the landlord. He could come and go whenever he wanted, and we'd never know. Detective Huang came down from the crawl space holding an evidence bag with the metal box inside. She set it on our kitchen table like it was radioactive, and Brenner explained what they'd found. The box was a wireless transmitter, the kind you could buy online for a few $100s, designed to send video signals to a remote receiver. The wires fed into tiny cameras, pinhole style, fitted into the holes we'd discovered. 4 cameras total, they'd counted. Bedroom, bathroom, and 2 in the living room we hadn't even found yet because they were hidden behind air vents. Huang asked if we'd given permission for any surveillance equipment, which was such an absurd question I almost laughed. Then Brenner asked for Vincent's contact information, and I handed over that business card with his smudged cell number. They tried calling him right there in front of us. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. Brenner left a message, professional and calm, asking Vincent to call back regarding an urgent matter at the property. We all knew he wouldn't call back. You could see it in the way the detectives looked at each other. That silent communication cops develop after working together long enough. Huang asked if we had anywhere else to stay tonight. The way she said it, like it wasn't really a question, made it clear we shouldn't be sleeping there. We ended up at Claire's parents' house in Harrisburg, about an hour away. Her mom kept trying to make tea and asking if we were hungry, doing that thing parents do when they don't know how to fix something, so they offer food instead. Claire's dad just sat there looking furious, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that metal box, those wires, Vincent's huge eyes behind those thick glasses staring at footage of us in our most private moments. How long had he been watching? Had he watched us on our wedding night when we came home late and exhausted? Had he seen every fight, every intimate moment, every time we walked around in our underwear thinking we were alone? The violation of it felt like something crawling under my skin. The next morning, Brenner called my cell. They'd gone to the address listed on Vincent's landlord registration. The house was empty. Not just empty like he wasn't home, but empty like he'd cleared out in a hurry. Neighbors said they'd seen him loading boxes into a van around midnight, just hours after we'd called the police. His cell phone was going straight to voicemail now, probably turned off or destroyed. They'd put out a bulletin for his vehicle, a white cargo van with Pennsylvania plates, but Brenner didn't sound optimistic about finding him quickly. What happened next is the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. 3 days after Vincent disappeared, Detective Huang called and asked if we could come down to the station. When we got there, she led us into a conference room where Brenner had spread out papers and photographs across the table, like some kind of horrifying puzzle. They'd started digging into Vincent's background, pulling property records and cross-referencing rental listings. Turns out our house wasn't the only one. Vincent owned 6 rental properties scattered across 3 counties in central Pennsylvania, all advertised as affordable housing for young couples and single women. The detectives had obtained warrants and searched every single property. 5 of them had the same setup. Holes in the walls, cameras hidden in bedrooms and bathrooms, wiring running to transmitters in crawl spaces or attics. One house in Altoona had 8 cameras installed. 8. Huang showed us a spreadsheet she'd created, listing the current and former tenants they'd identified going back 3 years. 22 people had lived in those houses during that time. 22 people who had no idea they'd been watched, recorded, violated in their own homes. Some had already moved away, gotten married, started families. The detectives were in the process of contacting everyone, and I could see the weight of it on Huang's face, knowing she'd have to make those phone calls and destroy people's sense of safety and privacy all over again. Brenner pulled out another folder, this one thicker, and explained that they'd executed a warrant for Vincent's financial records. He'd been paying for cloud storage, massive amounts of it, through an offshore service that specialized in, let's say, discretionary data hosting. The kind of service that doesn't ask questions and doesn't cooperate easily with law enforcement. They were working with federal investigators now because the scope had expanded beyond local jurisdiction. The FBI Cybercrimes Unit was involved, trying to trace where the footage had been uploaded and whether Vincent had distributed or sold any of it. That word "sold" hit me like a hammer. The idea that strangers might have paid money to watch me and Claire in our bedroom, that our most private moments might be saved on some server in another country, being traded around by people whose faces we'd never see. It made me want to vomit right there on the conference room table. Claire started crying again, and Huang pushed a box of tissues across the table with the kind of practiced gentleness that told me she'd done this too many times before. Brenner said they'd keep us updated, that they were doing everything possible to track Vincent down and secure any footage that might exist. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The internet is vast. Data can be copied, backed up, hidden in places even experts struggle to find. We never went back to that house. Claire couldn't even drive past the street without having a panic attack, and honestly, neither could I. We broke the lease, which legally we probably didn't have to do given the circumstances, but I didn't want to spend another second tied to anything Vincent owned. We moved into a cramped apartment in Harrisburg, closer to Claire's work and her family, a place with new construction and walls we could verify were solid all the way through. I became obsessive about checking for cameras. Every hotel room, every Airbnb, even bathrooms at friends' houses, I'd find myself scanning the walls and ceilings, looking for tiny holes or unusual objects positioned at weird angles. Claire started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. She'd come home from sessions exhausted and raw, and some nights she'd just sit on the couch staring at nothing while I made dinner neither of us wanted to eat. Our marriage took a hit. Not because we blamed each other, but because the invasion had poisoned something fundamental between us. Intimacy became complicated, loaded with the knowledge that someone had stolen it from us, and we could never get it back. We got through it, slowly, with a lot of therapy and patience and honest conversations that hurt like open wounds. But it changed us. You don't come back from something like that completely whole. Vincent Marsh was arrested 4 months later at a border crossing in Texas, trying to get into Mexico with fake identification. The cargo van was full of hard drives and equipment. Turns out he'd been planning this for a while, had money stashed in accounts under different names, probably anticipating the day someone would discover what he'd been doing. The trial took 2 years, dragged out by legal motions and evidence processing. The FBI recovered footage from multiple cloud accounts, thousands of hours of recordings spanning back to 2011. He'd been doing this for at least a decade, maybe longer. 22 victims became 43 as more people came forward after seeing news coverage. Some of the footage had been sold on dark web forums, distributed to networks of people who paid subscription fees to watch real surveillance of unsuspecting people. Vincent pleaded guilty eventually, probably because his lawyers knew a jury would bury him. He got 38 years in federal prison, no parole. He'll be 90 when he's eligible for release, if he lives that long. Huang called me the day the sentence came down. She said it was one of the longest sentences she'd seen for this type of crime, that the judge had been visibly disgusted during sentencing. It should have felt like victory, like justice, but mostly I just felt tired. Claire and I were in our new house by then, a place we'd bought instead of rented, where we'd personally inspected every inch before signing the papers. We're okay now, or as okay as you can be after something like this. We don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes I catch Claire staring at a wall with that distant look, and I know she's back there, in that bedroom on the edge of Fairmont, realizing someone was watching. The violation doesn't fade. You just learn to carry it differently. And every time I hear about someone finding a great deal on a rental, I want to tell them to check the walls first. Check everything. Because privacy is an illusion, and trust is a luxury not everyone deserves. Teaching 5th grade in Dalton felt like the kind of quiet life I needed after the chaos of my divorce 2 years prior. The town had maybe 8,000 people, tucked between the mountains in northwest Georgia, where everyone knew everyone and Sunday service at Covenant Fellowship wasn't optional if you wanted to fit in. I started attending because my principal, Mr. Warren, mentioned it during my interview, saying the church was the heart of the community and most of the school staff were members. Within my first month, I'd been welcomed with casseroles, invitations to potlucks, and warm smiles from people who seemed genuinely kind. The church itself was this beautiful old building with white columns and stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews during morning service. Everything felt safe, normal, like I'd finally found a place where I could rebuild my life and focus on my students without the drama I'd left behind in Savannah. But sometime around mid-October, I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. After service one Sunday, I saw 3 of my colleagues, including Beth Sullivan, who taught 3rd grade, huddled in the parking lot with Deacon Phillips and 2 other church elders I didn't know well. They were speaking in hushed tones, and when I waved at Beth, she looked almost startled before giving me this tight, forced smile and turning back to the group. The conversation stopped completely when I walked past them to my car. Then there was the Wednesday evening Bible study I'd started attending, where certain members would exchange these meaningful glances whenever someone mentioned the community committee, which I'd been told was just a charity organization that helped struggling families in the area. I'd asked about volunteering once, and the room had gone uncomfortably silent before someone changed the subject. People were friendly enough to my face, but I was starting to feel like there was this whole other layer to the church that I wasn't part of, like everyone was in on something I didn't understand. The warmth I'd initially felt was beginning to seem performative, calculated even, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. The thing that really kicked everything into gear happened on a Monday morning in late October. I arrived at school to find out that Beth Sullivan had resigned effective immediately. No 2 weeks notice, no goodbye, nothing. Her classroom was already being packed up by the janitor, and when I asked Mr. Warren about it, he got this weird look on his face and said Beth had personal matters to attend to and had moved out of state to be with family. But here's the thing that made my stomach turn. I'd had coffee with Beth just 3 days earlier, on Friday afternoon, and she'd been excitedly planning her classroom Halloween party. She'd shown me the decorations she'd bought, talked about how her kids were going to love the costume contest, and mentioned she was hosting Thanksgiving at her house this year for the first time. She didn't seem like someone about to uproot her entire life. I tried calling her cell phone during my lunch break, and it went straight to a disconnected number message. Her Facebook page was gone. It was like she'd been erased. I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the week. During Wednesday evening service, I noticed Beth's usual seat in the 4th pew was occupied by a family I'd never seen before, like the congregation had just moved on without missing a beat. After the service ended, I approached Deacon Phillips and asked if he knew how to reach Beth, saying I wanted to send her a card or something. The way his expression shifted made my chest tighten. He put his hand on my shoulder, this gesture that probably looked comforting to anyone watching, but his grip was firm enough to feel like a warning. He told me that Beth had made her choice, and it was best to respect her privacy and focus on my own responsibilities here. The way he emphasized here felt deliberate, pointed. When I mentioned that her phone was disconnected, he just smiled and said sometimes people need to make clean breaks, then walked away before I could ask anything else. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the conversation and realizing he'd never actually answered my question about how to contact her. Nobody had. The next Sunday I decided to do something probably stupid, but I couldn't help myself. After service, I lingered near the fellowship hall where coffee and donuts were set up, and I started casually asking other members if they'd heard from Beth. The reactions were all variations of the same theme: awkward pauses, quick subject changes, or these rehearsed-sounding responses about respecting her decision and moving forward. But it was Margaret Torres, the church secretary who'd always been chatty with me, who really confirmed my suspicions. When I asked her, she actually glanced around nervously before leaning in close and whispering that I should stop asking questions about Beth. Her exact words were, "Some people aren't cut out for the level of commitment this community requires, and it's better for everyone when they realize that sooner rather than later." When I pressed her on what she meant by commitment, she straightened up, plastered on a smile, and said she had to help clean up, practically speed-walking away from me. The whole exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it left me feeling genuinely unsettled. What kind of church talks about commitment like it's some binding contract you can't get out of? I started paying closer attention after that, really watching how people interacted. The community committee met every other Friday evening in the church basement, and I'd see the same group of maybe 20 people heading down there. Always the same faces, including Mr. Warren, Deacon Phillips, and several other teachers from school. They'd stay for exactly 2 hours, and when they came back up, they always looked serious, purposeful, like they'd just attended some important business meeting rather than a charity planning session. One Friday in early November, I made an excuse about leaving my sweater in the sanctuary and doubled back after everyone thought I'd left. I could hear voices coming from the basement, but the door at the top of the stairs was locked. I stood there for a minute, listening, and I could make out someone talking about maintaining the structure and ensuring compliance, which seemed like really weird language for organizing food drives or whatever they were supposedly doing. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs and I had to scramble back to my car, my heart absolutely pounding, feeling like a kid who'd almost gotten caught doing something wrong. What really sent me down the rabbit hole was finding Beth's lesson planner in the supply closet at school. I'd gone in looking for construction paper for my class, and there it was, shoved behind some boxes on the top shelf like someone had hidden it quickly. Her handwriting was all over it, plans sketched out through December, parent conference notes, everything. On the inside cover, she'd written her sister's phone number in California with a note that said, "Emily, emergency contact." I took a photo of the number with my phone and called it that evening from my apartment. A woman answered, and when I explained who I was and asked about Beth, there was this long, painful silence before she said Beth hadn't contacted any family members. Emily's voice cracked when she told me she'd filed a missing person report 2 weeks ago, but the police in Dalton had told her that Beth had resigned from her job voluntarily, and there was no evidence of foul play, so they weren't investigating. Emily said she'd driven down from California to look for her sister, had gone to the church and spoken with Deacon Phillips, and he'd told her the same story about Beth moving away for personal reasons. But Emily knew her sister, knew Beth would never just vanish without telling family, and she'd left Dalton feeling like everyone was lying to her but having no proof of anything. After I hung up with Emily, I sat on my couch for probably an hour just trying to process what this meant. A woman had vanished, her own sister couldn't find her, and an entire church congregation was apparently okay with pretending everything was normal. I thought about going to the police myself, but what would I even say? That people at my church were acting weird and my colleague had quit her job? There was nothing concrete, nothing illegal that I could point to. The next day at school, I noticed Mr. Warren watching me more closely than usual during the staff meeting. When it ended, he asked me to stay behind, and once everyone else had filed out, he closed the door and sat on the edge of his desk in this casual way that somehow made the whole thing feel more threatening. He asked how I was adjusting to the community, if I felt welcomed at church, and then he said he'd heard I'd been asking a lot of questions about Beth Sullivan. The way he looked at me when he said it made my mouth go dry. I tried to play it off, said I was just concerned about a friend, but he cut me off and said that sometimes curiosity can make a person's life more complicated than it needs to be. Those were his exact words. Then he smiled, told me he was sure I understood, and suggested I focus on being a positive presence for my students, rather than dwelling on people who'd chosen to move on. That conversation scared me more than anything else had up to that point, because it meant they knew I was digging, and they were watching me. I decided to back off for a while, attend church like normal, smile and nod, and pretend everything was fine. But I also started documenting things, writing down dates and names and strange interactions in a notebook I kept hidden in my apartment. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, I got a knock on my door around 8 at night. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Deacon Phillips standing there with 2 other men from the community committee, both wearing suits despite the late hour. My entire body went cold. I considered not answering, but my car was parked right outside, and all the lights in my apartment were on, so they obviously knew I was home. When I opened the door with the chain still latched, Deacon Phillips gave me that same unsettling smile and said they'd like to talk to me about joining the community committee. He said I'd shown such dedication to the church and the school that they felt I'd be a perfect addition to their organization. The way he phrased it didn't sound like an invitation, it sounded like an inevitability. I told them through the gap in the door that I appreciated the offer, but I was still fairly new to the area and wanted to settle in more before taking on additional commitments. One of the other men, someone whose name I didn't know but who I'd seen at every service, stepped closer and said that membership in the committee wasn't really optional for people who were serious about being part of the Covenant Fellowship community. He said it in this matter-of-fact tone, like he was explaining simple math to a child. Deacon Phillips added that everyone at the church who held any position of influence or respect was part of the committee, and that my principal, Mr. Warren, had specifically recommended me. He said they had a special initiation meeting this coming Friday, and they'd expect to see me there at 7 in the evening. When I started to protest, to say I needed time to think about it, the third man finally spoke up and mentioned how unfortunate it had been that Beth Sullivan hadn't understood the importance of commitment, how she'd made things difficult for herself by trying to walk away. The implicit threat in his words was crystal clear. I managed to tell them I'd think about it and close the door, then immediately pushed my couch against it and spent the rest of the night planning what the hell I was going to do. I knew I couldn't just refuse and stay in Dalton. Whatever this community committee actually was, they clearly had enough influence to make people disappear without consequences, and the local police were either part of it or too intimidated to investigate. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. I called in sick to school, went to the bank and withdrew everything from my checking account, and started packing only what would fit in my car. I didn't give notice to my landlord, didn't tell anyone at school I was leaving, didn't post anything on social media. I loaded up my sedan that afternoon while most people were still at work, threw my notebook with all my documentation into my bag, and planned to leave Friday morning before dawn, hours before that 7 o'clock meeting they expected me at. But Thursday night, around 11, I heard footsteps on the stairs leading up to my second-floor apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps, and then they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath in the darkness, watching the shadow of feet visible under the door gap. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then I heard a piece of paper slide under my door. When the footsteps finally retreated, I waited another 10 minutes before turning on a light and picking up the paper. It was a printed schedule for tomorrow's initiation ceremony, with my name already typed at the top, along with a note that said, "We look forward to welcoming you into our family. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity you won't want to miss." I didn't sleep at all that night. At 3 in the morning, I grabbed my bags, left my apartment key on the counter, and walked as quietly as I could down to my car. The street was completely empty and dark except for one streetlight flickering at the end of the block. I threw everything in the trunk, got in the driver's seat, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Just as the engine started, I saw headlights turn onto my street from the far end. A dark SUV moving slowly, like it was patrolling. I didn't wait to see if it was coming for me. I pulled out and drove in the opposite direction, taking back roads out of town, constantly checking my rearview mirror for anyone following me. I drove for 6 hours straight, didn't stop except for gas, and ended up at my cousin's place in North Carolina by mid-morning. I stayed with her for 2 weeks, barely leaving her apartment, jumping at every unexpected sound. I finally worked up the courage to call Emily, Beth's sister, and told her everything that had happened to me. She broke down crying and said she'd suspected something like this but had no way to prove it. Together, we contacted the FBI field office in Charlotte, and I turned over my notebook with all the documentation. An agent took my statement and said they'd look into it, but warned me that without concrete evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do immediately. He did say that Dalton had come up before in relation to some financial irregularities involving a church organization, and my information might help build a case, but it could take months or even years. He strongly advised me not to return to Dalton under any circumstances. It's been 8 months since I left, and I'm teaching at a different school now in a different state, using my maiden name from before my marriage. I check the news from Dalton compulsively, looking for any updates, but there's been nothing about the church or the community committee. Beth Sullivan is still listed as a missing person with no new developments. Emily texts me sometimes, and we both hold on to this thin hope that maybe the investigation will eventually uncover something. But I'm not holding my breath. What keeps me up at night is thinking about how many people might still be trapped in that system, too afraid to leave, or too deep into whatever that organization actually does. I've had nightmares where I'm back in that church basement, where the locked door opens and I see what they were really doing down there. But I always wake up before finding out. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed and fought harder to expose them. But then I remember the look in Deacon Phillips's eyes when he stood at my door, and I know I made the only choice I could. I'm safe now. I have a new job and a new start. But I'll never really feel settled again. I'll always be looking around corners, always wondering if someone from Covenant Fellowship might track me down, because I'm the one who got away and talked to the FBI. That's what they took from me, even though I escaped. They took my ability to ever feel completely safe again, to trust a community, to believe that friendly faces in a small town church are actually what they appear to be. And somewhere in Dalton, Georgia, they're still meeting every other Friday in that basement, still maintaining their structure and ensuring compliance, still making people disappear when they ask too many questions. Everyone wants the full story, but here's the thing. I can't give it to them. The detectives, the therapists, my own parents sitting across from me with those desperate eyes, they all want this clean narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. What I've got instead are these jagged pieces of memory that don't fit together right, like a puzzle someone threw against a wall. What I can tell you is where it started. A Friday night in September, me and 4 friends driving out to some abandoned trailer park off Highway 56 because we were 17 and stupid and thought we were invincible. My buddy Josh had been going on about this place for weeks, saying his older brother told him squatters had turned it into some kind of commune, the kind of place where people went to disappear on purpose, he said, which should have been our first clue to stay the hell away. But when you grow up in a Kansas town where watching wheat grow counts as entertainment, an abandoned trailer park 12 miles outside town sounds like the most interesting thing that's happened all year. I remember climbing into Josh's pickup that night, the 5 of us passing around cheap vodka, laughing about nothing, completely unaware we were driving towards something that would break us all in different ways. The trailer park sat at the end of a dirt road that carved through an old cornfield, the kind that had been left to rot into these tall, dried-out husks that scraped against the truck as we drove through. Someone had spray-painted a crooked arrow on a rusted mailbox where we turned off the highway, pointing us deeper into nowhere. When Josh's headlights finally swept across the clearing, I counted maybe a dozen trailers arranged in this weird circle, most of them sagging on one side or covered in thick vines that made them look like they were being swallowed by the earth. The whole place had this carnival after dark feeling, like something that was supposed to be fun once but had turned into something else entirely. We sat there in the truck for a minute after Josh cut the engine, and that's when I heard it, this low mechanical hum coming from somewhere in the darkness. A generator, I realized, which meant someone was using electricity out here. Amber, Josh's girlfriend, said maybe we should just go, that if people were actually living here we were trespassing. But Josh was already laughing it off. He said anyone squatting in a place like this wasn't going to call the cops on some teenagers. Kevin had his door open before any of us could argue further, flashlight already on, heading toward the nearest trailer like he owned the place. The rest of us followed because that's what you do when you're 17. You follow your friends into the dark, even when every instinct you have is screaming at you to run. The first trailer Kevin approached had its door hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. He stepped inside and we heard him moving around, his footsteps creaking on what sounded like rotted floorboards. When he came back out, he said it was empty, except for some old furniture and needles scattered everywhere. The kind with the orange caps that you see in documentaries about the opioid crisis. Josh made some joke about junkies and we moved to the next trailer, then the next, finding more of the same. Stripped mattresses, broken glass, that sour smell of mildew and something worse underneath. Stephanie hung back near the truck, her arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold. She kept saying she wanted to leave, that this place felt wrong, but nobody really listened to her. We were too busy trying to act braver than we felt, shining our flashlights into dark corners and daring each other to go deeper into the trailers. It was Josh who noticed the trailer at the far end of the circle looked different from the others. Newer, or at least better maintained. The windows had curtains, actual curtains, not just sheets, and there was a concrete block serving as a front step. No vines growing up the sides. That generator sound was louder near this one, definitely coming from underneath or behind it. Kevin said we should check it out and Josh agreed immediately, like this was some kind of adventure game and we were collecting points. I remember my heart was pounding harder than it should have been, this animal part of my brain sending up warning flares, but I followed anyway because the alternative was standing alone in the dark. We approached the trailer slowly, and that's when I noticed the door wasn't just closed. It had a deadbolt on the outside, a big industrial one, the kind you'd use on a storage unit, installed where someone inside couldn't reach it. Josh touched it and the metal was new. No rust like everything else in this place. Amber asked why anyone would lock a trailer from the outside and nobody had an answer that made sense. Kevin tried the door anyway and it swung open, unlocked, and the smell that came out was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Chemical and sweet at the same time, with this underlying rot that made my eyes water. The inside was dark except for a faint blue glow coming from somewhere in the back. We stood in the doorway, none of us wanting to be the first one to step inside, and that's when we heard it. A sound like fabric dragging across floor, coming from deeper in the trailer. Something or someone was in there with us, moving in the darkness. Josh shined his flashlight toward the sound, and the beam landed on a figure slumped against the far wall, a woman maybe in her 20s or 30s. It was hard to tell. She was staring at us but not really seeing us. Her eyes glassy and unfocused, and her lips were moving like she was talking, but no sound was coming out. She wore a stained tank top and her arms were covered in track marks, some fresh enough that they still looked angry and red. Kevin started backing up immediately, saying we needed to get out of there, that this was someone's shooting gallery and we were going to get in serious trouble. But Amber moved forward instead, asking the woman if she was okay, if she needed help. The woman's head lolled to the side, and she made this wet clicking sound in her throat. And I realized she wasn't just high, she was barely conscious, maybe overdosing right in front of us. Stephanie was already running back to the truck, yelling that she was calling 911. But Josh grabbed her and said we couldn't call the cops because we'd been drinking and we'd all get arrested. We were arguing about what to do, our voices getting louder and more panicked, when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots on gravel, multiple sets coming from different directions. The generator sound cut out and everything went silent, except for those footsteps getting closer. I don't remember making the decision to hide. My body just moved on its own, pulling me deeper into the trailer, away from the door. Josh and Amber ducked down behind a couch that was leaking stuffing, and Kevin pressed himself against the wall near the bathroom. The woman on the floor didn't react at all, just kept staring at nothing with that slack expression. Then there were voices outside, men's voices, speaking in quick Spanish that I couldn't fully understand, but the tone was clear. They were angry about something. A flashlight beam swept through the open door and someone shouted, asking who was out there, who'd been in their property. The beam landed on Stephanie, who'd only made it halfway to the truck before the lights came on. She stood there like a deer on the highway, caught completely, and I watched through the grimy window as 3 men emerged from between the trailers. They weren't what I expected. No face tattoos or gang colors, just regular-looking guys in work clothes, the kind you'd see at any construction site or farm supply store. One of them had a pistol tucked into his waistband. He walked up to Stephanie and asked her real calm where her friends were. Said he knew she hadn't come alone because he'd seen the truck. She didn't answer, couldn't answer probably, and he grabbed her arm and started walking her toward the center of the circle, toward the other trailers we hadn't explored yet. That's when Josh made the stupidest decision of his life and ran out after her. He was yelling something about leaving her alone, about how we were just kids and we'd leave and never come back. But his voice cracked halfway through and it just sounded pathetic and desperate. The man with the gun didn't even hesitate. He pulled it out and pointed it at Josh's chest, told him to get on his knees right now or he'd put a hole in him. Josh dropped like his legs had been cut out from under him. Amber started crying next to me, these quiet hiccuping sobs she was trying to muffle with her hand, and I clamped my own hand over her mouth because I knew if they heard us, we were done. Through the window, I watched as two more men appeared, one of them talking on a cell phone in rapid Spanish, and I caught enough words to understand they were calling someone, asking what to do about the kids who'd found the place. The man on the phone kept saying CC and nodding, and when he hung up, his face looked grim. He walked over to Josh and Stephanie and told them they were going to take a little walk, that if they cooperated, nobody had to get hurt. Josh asked what about his friends in the truck, lying badly, and the man smiled this thin smile and said they'd find them too, not to worry. They started walking, the two of them, toward the far side of the circle, toward trailers I now realized had been modified somehow, with metal reinforcements around the doors and windows that looked like bars. Kevin whispered that we had to run, right now while they were distracted, but I couldn't move. I was watching Josh and Stephanie being led away and my brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. Then the woman on the floor behind us started making this horrible keening sound, this animal noise of pure distress, and one of the men heard it. He turned back toward our trailer and started walking, calling out to someone named Luis, saying he needed to check on the girl in number 7. That was us. We were in number 7. Amber bolted first, running out the back window that someone had left partially open, and Kevin went right after her. I should have followed immediately, but I hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, looking at that woman on the floor, who was clearly a prisoner here, clearly someone who needed help. And those 3 seconds cost me everything. The man came through the door just as I was climbing toward the window, and he grabbed my ankle and pulled hard. I hit the floor, and all the air went out of my lungs, and when I looked up, there was a different man standing over me, older than the others, with graying hair and these absolutely dead eyes. He said something in Spanish to the guy holding me, then switched to English and told me I'd made a very big mistake tonight. That they'd been running a good operation here for 2 years without problems, and now they had to figure out what to do with a bunch of nosy kids who couldn't mind their own business. They zip-tied my hands behind my back and walked me to one of the modified trailers, the one with the heaviest bars on the windows. Inside it was divided into compartments, these small rooms created with plywood walls that didn't reach the ceiling, and I could hear people in the other sections, breathing, shifting, someone crying softly. They shoved me into one of these rooms and the door had a padlock on the outside, just like that first trailer. The space was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a thin mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. There was sound insulation stapled to the walls, the kind you see in recording studios, which explained why nobody outside had ever heard anything from this place. Josh was in the compartment next to mine. I could hear him through the thin plywood, asking if I was okay, his voice shaking. Stephanie was somewhere further down, calling out for Amber and Kevin, begging them to get help. One of the men banged on the wall and told us to shut up or he'd give us something to really cry about. The hours that followed are the blurriest part of my memory. I know we were kept in those rooms while they decided what to do with us. I know they brought us water and these protein bars that tasted like cardboard, keeping us alive but barely. I know Josh tried to kick his door down at some point and they came in and beat him badly enough that he stopped making noise for a long time. What I learned later, after everything, was that Amber and Kevin had made it back to the highway. They'd run through that cornfield in complete darkness, getting cut up by the dried stalks, and flagged down a semi-truck around 3 in the morning. The driver let them use his CB radio to call for help, and they told the police everything: the trailer park, the men with guns, their 3 friends who'd been taken. But here's the thing about Kansas County police departments at 3 in the morning. They're understaffed and skeptical, especially when 2 drunk teenagers show up with a story about armed men and kidnapping in an abandoned trailer park that most locals didn't even know existed. The officer who responded thought they were either pulling a prank or had gotten into some kind of drug deal gone wrong. He drove out to Highway 56 with them at dawn, but couldn't find the turnoff they described. That spray-painted arrow on the mailbox was gone, painted over with brown that matched the rust. The dirt road through the cornfield had been smoothed out somehow, and without that clear path, the officer didn't want to drive his cruiser through private farmland on the word of 2 scared kids who couldn't give him an exact location. He took a report and told them he'd follow up, but Amber said she could tell he didn't believe them. It took 3 days and both sets of parents raising hell before the sheriff's department organized a real search, and by then we'd been moved. They transported us at night in a panel van with no windows, drove for what felt like hours on roads that went from paved to gravel to dirt. When they finally let us out, we were at a different location entirely, some kind of warehouse or industrial building that smelled like chemicals and had these huge ventilation fans running constantly. The operation was bigger than I'd understood. There were maybe 20 other people being held there, ranging from teenagers to people in their 40s, all in various states of withdrawal or sedation. I realized we'd stumbled into something way beyond a local drug operation. They were using people as mules, as labor, as leverage against family members who owed money. The man with the dead eyes, the one who seemed to be in charge, told us we'd work off our debt for trespassing and causing problems. He said we'd ruined a good setup and cost them money and having to relocate, so now we owed them. Josh kept insisting we were just kids, that our parents would pay whatever they wanted, but the man laughed and said our parents couldn't pay what we'd cost them. For weeks, maybe months, time stopped meaning anything in that place. We sorted pills, packaged powder into baggies, loaded and unloaded trucks that came in the middle of the night. They kept us compliant with just enough food to function and occasional doses of something that made everything feel far away and unimportant. Stephanie stopped talking after the first week. Josh tried to escape once and they broke 3 of his fingers as a lesson to the rest of us. The fragmented memories I have are mostly from this period. Days blending together, the constant noise of those ventilation fans, the chemical taste in my mouth that never went away. But I also remember the moment everything changed. A woman showed up one day, someone new they'd brought in, and she was different from the rest of us. She wasn't scared, she was angry, loudly, violently angry, screaming at the guards about a lawyer and her husband, and how people knew where she was. They tried to shut her up, but she wouldn't stop, and I think that's what finally brought attention to the place. Because 3 days after she arrived, I woke up to the sound of doors being smashed in and men in tactical gear yelling for everyone to get on the ground. Federal agents, it turned out, DEA and FBI. They'd been investigating the drug ring for over a year, but couldn't find their main distribution center until this woman, a county prosecutor's wife who'd been grabbed by mistake, a case of mistaken identity, went missing, and her husband tore apart every lead with resources we never had. They raided 4 locations simultaneously that morning in January, recovered 37 people total, and arrested 23 men connected to an operation that stretched from the Midwest to the East Coast. Josh, Stephanie, and I were separated immediately, taken to different hospitals, debriefed by so many different agencies that their faces all blur together now. My parents cried when they saw me, and I couldn't cry back. I'd forgotten how, somewhere in those months. The worst part was learning that Kevin had died 2 weeks after escaping. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage, his truck running, officially ruled an accident, but everyone who knew him understood what it really was. The guilt of leaving us behind had eaten him alive. They tell me I should feel lucky to be alive, that most people in situations like ours don't come home at all. The prosecutors used our testimony to put away the main operators for life, and the FBI shut down the entire network. That trailer park off Highway 56 was bulldozed within a month of our rescue. The whole area fenced off and turned into nothing, like it never existed at all. Josh moved to Colorado with his family right after the trials ended. I heard he's doing better now, working at a ski resort, trying to build a normal life. Stephanie's in intensive therapy somewhere on the East Coast. Her parents won't say where exactly. Amber finished high school online and left town the day she turned 18. I stayed because running felt like letting them win, even though I see that warehouse every time I close my eyes and smell those chemicals every time it rains. My high school graduating class walked in 2014 and I wasn't there. I was still doing physical therapy, still trying to remember how to be a person instead of just a body that follows orders. Sometimes people recognize me around town, the kid who survived that thing with the drug trailers, and they get this look like they want to ask questions but don't know how. I don't blame them. I wouldn't know what to ask either. The detectives say my fragmented memory is normal for trauma, that pieces might come back or they might not, and I should focus on moving forward instead of trying to reconstruct everything. But here's what I know for certain. There are more places like that warehouse out there. More operations running right now in spaces people drive past every day without noticing. And there are still people in those places, waiting for someone to stumble across them the way we did, hoping their luck turns out better than ours. My cousin Rita had this way of making everything seem fixable, even when it wasn't. Wednesday evening in January 2024, I sat at her kitchen table just outside Springfield, Missouri, signing papers that ended my marriage while she heated up leftover pot roast and told me about her plans for spring planting. My birthday had passed the week before. 39 felt different than 38 somehow, heavier. And here I was starting from scratch with a new apartment in town, and a job that kept me staring at wrecked cars all day. Insurance adjusting pays decent, but it teaches you to see damage everywhere, calculate loss like it's just numbers on a form. Rita kept the conversation light, asked about work, avoided mentioning my ex-wife's name. By the time I left around 7, the sun had already set, leaving that dead gray light that makes Missouri winter feel twice as cold. County Road 48 was my usual route home, 40 minutes of farmland and scattered houses set so far back from the road you could barely see them. I'd driven it 100 times, knew every curve and dip. Around mile marker 31, my 2015 Ford F-150 started making this grinding noise that shot straight through the floorboard. The engine shuddered hard, the whole truck vibrated, and then everything just quit. I managed to coast onto the shoulder near a beaten mailbox with Pruitt spray-painted crooked across the front. Tried the ignition 3 times, got nothing but clicking and that horrible metal-on-metal sound. One car passed without slowing, taillights vanishing around the bend like it couldn't get away fast enough. I pulled out my phone, saw 2 bars of signal, and searched for a tow truck. Most of the big companies showed wait times over an hour. Then I found Anchor Towing. Local number, promised 15-minute response, available all hours. I called, and a man answered so fast I barely heard it ring, his voice gravelly and worn, like he'd been waiting by the phone. He asked where I was, and I told him County Road 48, near the Pruitt mailbox at mile marker 31. He didn't ask for more details, didn't need the make and model of my truck, nothing about what was wrong with it. Just said, "Yeah, I know where that is. Be there in 10, and hung up before I could even say thanks. The whole call lasted maybe 20 seconds. I sat there in the cab, heater still blowing cold air because the engine was dead, and realized I hadn't asked about the price or what shop he was taking me to. But honestly, I just wanted to get home, peel off these clothes that still smelled like Rita's kitchen, and sleep for about 12 hours straight. The road stayed empty. No headlights in either direction. Just the wind pushing dead leaves across the asphalt, and the distant shape of a barn I could barely make out against the darkening sky. Then, headlights appeared from the direction I'd come. moving fast. Way faster than you'd expect a tow truck to move, especially on a road like this with all its turns. The lights swept around the bend, and I could see it wasn't one of those big professional rigs with the company name plastered across the side in bright letters. It was a Chevy Silverado, maybe early 2000s, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the fading light. It had a tow bar welded to the back and one of those yellow rotating beacons on the roof, the kind you can buy at any auto parts store and stick on with a magnet. On the driver's door was a decal, Anchor Towing, with an anchor symbol and a phone number, but it looked homemade, like someone had printed it on their computer and stuck it on with adhesive. The truck pulled up behind mine and the driver got out, leaving his headlights on so they lit up the whole scene in harsh white light that made everything look strange and flat. The guy who stepped out was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a stained Carhartt jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His face was hard to make out with the headlights behind him, but I could see he was older, probably in his 50s, with a gray beard that needed trimming and a baseball cap pulled low. He walked up to my window, and I rolled it down, cold air rushing in. He smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, that combination every mechanic seems to carry around like cologne. "Engine's done, huh?" he said, not really asking. His voice was the same one from the phone, rough and flat, no warmth in it. I nodded and explained the grinding noise, how everything just died, and he listened without looking at me, his eyes scanning my truck like he was appraising it. When I finished talking, he just said, "I'll hook you up, take you to my shop. It's about 20 minutes from here, just off Highway 12. He didn't mention a price, didn't ask if I wanted to call anyone, didn't hand me a business card or a form to sign. He worked fast, moving around to the back of my truck with a chain that clanked loud in the quiet. I got out to watch, mostly because sitting in the cab doing nothing made me feel useless, and also because some part of me, the part that spends all day documenting accident scenes, wanted to see how he was rigging it up. The setup looked solid enough, chains looped through the frame, hooks secured, but there was something sloppy about it, like he'd done this 1,000 times and stopped caring about the details. He worked without talking, didn't make small talk about the weather or ask what I did for a living, none of that casual conversation tow truck drivers usually throw at you to fill the silence. When he finished, he straightened up and said, "You can ride with me or stay in your truck, doesn't matter." His tone made it clear he didn't care either way. I hesitated, looking between his Silverado and my F-150, and something in my gut twitched, just a small, uncomfortable feeling I couldn't name. But I was tired, emotionally wrung out, and this guy was my ride. I told him I'd stay in my truck. He shrugged like I'd just told him the sky was blue and walked back to his Silverado without another word. I climbed into my F-150, settled into the driver's seat even though I had no control anymore, and watched through the rear window as he got into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, louder than it should have been, and then we started moving. The jerk when we first pulled onto the road was rough, rattled my teeth, but then it smoothed out into this weird gliding feeling, being pulled along by someone else's momentum. I kept my phone in my hand, screen lit up showing 7:30, and watched the road slide past in reverse through my side mirror. We went maybe 2 miles before he made a turn I didn't recognize, onto a narrower road with no street sign, just gravel and dirt packed hard from years of use. Trees pressed in close on both sides, branches scraping the top of my truck with this rhythmic scratching sound that set my nerves on edge. That's when I realized I had no idea where this shop was supposed to be. He'd said Highway 12, but we were heading away from it, deeper into back roads I'd never been on. I tried to remember if there were any repair shops out this way and came up blank. My phone still had 1 bar of signal, just barely hanging on. I thought about calling Rita, telling her where I was, but what would I even say? That I had a bad feeling about the tow truck driver who was doing exactly what I'd paid him to do. That sounded paranoid, like the stress of the day was making me see danger where there wasn't any. But my hands wouldn't stop gripping the phone tighter, and I kept watching the trees pass by, looking for something familiar, some landmark that would tell me we were going the right direction. Nothing. Just more trees, more darkness, and that horrible scratching sound every time a branch dragged across my roof. Then he turned again, onto an even smaller road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, and the pavement gave way entirely to dirt. The beacon on his roof kept spinning, throwing yellow light across the trees in sick rotating patterns. We'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when he slowed down near a clearing on the left side of the road. Through the windshield, I could see the outline of a structure, maybe a shed or a small building, set back about 30 feet from the road. No lights on inside, no sign, nothing that looked like a legitimate repair shop. Just a dark shape against darker trees. My entire body went rigid. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He pulled to a stop and the Silverado's engine kept running, that rough idle vibrating through the chains into my truck. I watched him in the side mirror, saw him open his door and step out, moving toward the back where the chains were connected. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to do something, but I was hooked to his truck, couldn't drive away even if my engine worked. My phone showed no signal now, just an empty bar mocking me in the corner of the screen. I locked my doors, stupid, pointless, but it was all I could think to do. He appeared at my window, standing there in the yellow rotating light, and tapped on the glass with his knuckle. Not aggressive, just a casual tap, like he had all the time in the world. I didn't roll it down. Through the glass, I could see his face clearly now, and there was something empty in his expression, mechanical, like he was going through motions he'd rehearsed. He said something I couldn't hear through the window, gestured toward the building. I shook my head, held up my phone, pointed at the screen showing no signal, then made a gesture like I was calling someone. Universal sign for, I'm not getting out. I have people who know where I am. Complete lie, but I sold it hard. His face didn't change. He stood there for what felt like 10 minutes but was probably 30 seconds, just staring at me through the glass. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He pulled out his own phone, looked at it, put it back in his pocket and walked back to his truck without saying another word. I heard his door slam and then nothing happened. We just sat there, his engine running, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then headlights appeared behind us, coming up the dirt road fast. A vehicle rounded the bend, high beams cutting through the darkness, and I've never been so relieved to see another human being in my entire life. It was a patrol car, county sheriff, and it pulled up maybe 20 feet behind the Silverado with its lights going. A deputy got out, flashlight in hand, and walked up to the driver's side of the tow truck. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the deputy's posture change, see him step back and put his hand near his belt. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes, and then the deputy walked over to my window. I rolled it down immediately, cold air rushing in along with the sound of the deputy's radio crackling. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a clean-shaved face and sharp eyes that took in everything. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, and his voice had that careful calm cops use when they think something's wrong, but don't want to spook anyone. I told him I'd called for a tow. My truck broke down on County Road 48, and this guy showed up saying he'd take me to his shop. The deputy nodded slowly, glanced back at the Silverado, then asked me, "Did you get a card or any paperwork from him?" I said no, and his jaw tightened just slightly. The deputy told me to stay put and walked back to the Silverado. Whatever he said to the driver made the guy get out of his truck with his hands visible, and within minutes another patrol car showed up, then another. They had the driver standing by the hood of his Silverado, talking to him, checking his identification, running something on their radios. One of the deputies came over and explained they'd been looking for this guy for 3 weeks. Apparently there'd been a string of incidents, people calling for tow trucks on rural roads, drivers showing up fast with homemade decals and no legitimate business license, then either robbing the stranded motorists or, in 2 cases, the people in their vehicles just vanished entirely until their trucks were found abandoned days later in different counties. The fake tow driver would target people alone on empty roads, use the isolation against them, and the decal on his door could peel right off when he was done. They'd been tracking reports but couldn't pin him down until tonight. The deputy said the only reason they found me was because someone had called in a suspicious vehicle, matching the description heading down this road. Probably a neighbor who'd seen the beacon light through the trees and thought it was strange. They unhooked my truck right there on the dirt road and called a legitimate towing company out of Springfield to come get me. Took another hour before they arrived, and I spent that time sitting in the back of a patrol car with a blanket around my shoulders, watching them process the scene. The building in the clearing turned out to be an abandoned hunting cabin. Nothing inside but some old furniture and evidence of other people having been there recently. Rope, duct tape, a toolbox. The deputy who'd found me said I'd gotten lucky in ways I probably didn't fully understand yet. That staying in my truck and refusing to get out had likely saved my life. When the real tow truck finally showed up, a bright red rig with the company name in huge letters and a driver who had paperwork and a business card, and asked me a dozen questions about my insurance, I felt like I could breathe again. They took me and my F-150 to a shop in town, and I called Rita from there around midnight to tell her what happened. She cried, which made me realize how close I'd actually come to not making that call at all. The guy they arrested turned out to have a record: assault, theft, a bunch of other charges going back years. I had to give a statement to the police, went through the whole thing again in detail, and they told me I'd probably have to testify if it went to trial. I said I would, absolutely, whatever they needed. That was 3 months ago now, and I still won't drive County Road 48 at night. Still check the credentials of any service person before they touch my vehicle. Still get a knot in my chest when I see a tow truck beacon spinning in the dark. Some guy in a fake uniform with a homemade decal almost made me disappear, and the only reason I'm here typing this is because I listened to that small, uncomfortable feeling in my gut and refused to get out of my truck. Trust that feeling. Always. Folks around our town always said the bridge at Mason Creek had a bad feeling to it. It sits about 3 miles past the diner where I work, tucked behind a patch of pine trees and fog that never really lifts. The asphalt there crumbles into dirt, and when the wind blows through, it whistles through the cracks like the bridge is breathing. I had lived in Claymore all my life, waiting tables since I was 18, and I knew every regular's car by sight. That is why, when I drove home after my shift one night and saw a silver Honda parked near the guardrail with no lights on, it caught my attention immediately. At first, I figured someone broke down. Happens all the time when folks take the back roads to avoid the state patrol. But when I passed by the next night and saw a different car in almost the same spot, an old maroon Buick this time, I felt a strange sense of repetition that stuck with me. People in town started whispering about it too. A delivery guy said he'd seen 3 cars left there in the last week, always after midnight, always gone by morning. Nobody knew who they belonged to, and nobody really wanted to stop and check. Then came the night I noticed a beat-up blue Ford Fusion parked right under the bridge's main arch. I recognized it right away. It belonged to Casey, one of the waitresses who worked the late shift with me at the diner. Casey had been covering extra hours because her boyfriend lost his job, and she usually left around the same time I did. Seeing her car sitting there, engine off, door slightly cracked open, made my chest tighten in a way I can't fully describe. I pulled over a little ahead of the bridge, cut the headlights, and just sat there, watching the Ford. The whole place was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The bridge lights had gone out years ago, so the only thing I could see was the faint gleam of metal from the car's bumper catching my high beams. I called Casey's phone, no answer. Tried again, nothing. That was when I noticed a faint flicker of light inside her car, like someone using a flashlight or maybe a lighter. It blinked twice, then disappeared. For a few seconds I thought about turning around and pretending I never saw it. But curiosity has always been my worst habit. I stepped out of my car, leaving the engine idling just in case I needed to bolt. The air smelled like wet iron, sharp and heavy. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I moved closer to Casey's car, calling her name softly. No answer. I peeked through the driver's window and saw her purse still on the seat, Her phone face down beside it, the screen cracked. But the back seat was empty. That small light I'd seen earlier wasn't there anymore, and the silence felt deeper, as if the woods had stopped breathing too. Something about that bridge always messed with radios, but I had my work walkie-talkie in my apron pocket from the diner. It wasn't meant for long distance, yet a faint voice came through when I turned it on. Static first, then a man's voice. Steady, low, like he was talking right next to my ear. "You out here too?" he said. I froze in place, listening. The signal hissed, then he spoke again. "Bridge is quiet tonight, just the way I like it." His tone was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. I backed away from the car, keeping my eyes on the dark stretch of bridge ahead. There were faint tire marks near the guardrail, fresh ones that hadn't been there before. That was when I heard it. The slow grind of a diesel engine starting somewhere beyond the trees. The kind of deep rumble you feel in your ribs. The sound echoed under the bridge, bouncing around like it had nowhere else to go. I crouched behind Casey's car, heart hammering, and watched as a semi-truck's headlights blinked on in the distance. It crept forward like it was stalking something. The driver never used the horn, never flashed the brights, just rolled closer until the grille reflected in the water beneath the bridge. I caught a glimpse of the trailer's paint, dull red with peeling white letters that might have once spelled a company name. I remember thinking that whoever was behind that wheel wasn't just passing through. They were waiting. The truck stopped in the middle of the bridge, its headlights dimmed, leaving everything bathed in weak moonlight. A voice crackled through my walkie again. Same man, same calm tone. "She came out to meet me, you know. Said she heard me calling." My chest tightened. Casey had told me once she liked to listen to old CB channels while closing up the diner. Said they made the drive home less lonely. The man kept talking, describing her hair, her voice, how she sounded scared when she realized there was no signal down here. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. Then the truck's door opened. I could see the driver's outline against the cab light, broad shoulders, baseball cap, face hidden by shadow. He leaned out and tossed something over the bridge rail. It hit the water with a soft splash. I felt my throat close up. The radio clicked again, quieter now. Sometimes they answer, sometimes they don't. His engine roared back to life, and the truck rolled off into the trees, taillights fading until the night swallowed them whole. I didn't go to the police until morning. When they checked the bridge, they found Casey's phone, the same one I'd seen in her car, shattered near the guardrail. They said the signal from her last call had bounced off an unregistered frequency, one the highway patrol hadn't used in decades. A few weeks later, they traced similar disappearances to truck stops along the interstate, each near a bridge, each victim last heard talking on CB channels no one was supposed to be using anymore. To this day, that stretch of road stays empty after dark. People in Claymore say it's haunted, but I don't think it's ghosts keeping folks away. Sometimes late at night, the diner's radio picks up faint chatter from a channel that shouldn't exist. Just a man's voice, clear as if he's sitting at the counter. "Anyone out there near the bridge?" he says. "It's real quiet tonight." Classes had been exhausting that semester, and I was desperate for a quiet weekend to make some money. When my roommate mentioned a family who needed a babysitter for 2 nights, it felt like a perfect break from the campus chaos. The family lived in a tidy 2-story house on the edge of a small Oregon town. Quiet, tree-lined streets where everyone seemed to know each other. The mother, Erin, met me at the door with the kind of warmth that felt practiced, but not unkind. Her husband, Patrick, was supposedly leaving that evening for a business trip to Portland, and the 2 kids, Max and Lily, were already in their pajamas when I arrived. Erin gave me a quick tour of the house, moving a little too fast through each room, pointing out the snacks, the camera monitors, the back door, the alarm code. She kept saying how much she appreciated me coming on short notice. Her voice trembled just slightly when she mentioned Patrick's trip, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. Before she left, she kissed both kids on the forehead, reminded me not to open the door for anyone, and promised to be back by late morning. When the door clicked shut, the silence in that big house felt heavier than it should have. The night started out fine. Max and Lily were good kids, restless but polite. We played a board game, watched an old animated movie, and they fell asleep by 9. After cleaning up the living room, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, scrolling through my phone, while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. The only light came from the little night bulb over the sink, making everything look faded and distant. The house felt peaceful, almost too still, like it was waiting for something. Around midnight, the first knock came. 3 dull taps on the back door, slow and deliberate. I figured it might be a neighbor, someone who had noticed Aaron's car gone and wanted to check in. Still, something in the rhythm of those knocks made me hesitate. I opened the kitchen tablet to check the porch camera. The grainy feed lit up, and I swear my breath caught when I saw the man on the screen. Patrick, standing there in the cold, his face lit by the porch light. At first I thought maybe the trip had been canceled, but something about the way he stood there, completely still, staring straight into the camera, made my throat tighten. He wasn't knocking anymore, just standing in the same position, his hands at his sides. The porch light flickered once and the feed glitched for half a second. When it came back, he was gone. I remember walking to the door and checking the lock twice before stepping back and texting Erin. No answer. Then I called her. Straight to voicemail. A few minutes later, a soft scratching sound came from the side of the house, like branches scraping the siding, except there were no trees close enough for that. I turned off the kitchen light to get a clearer view through the window. Outside, the yard looked empty. The swing set in the corner moved slightly, just enough to catch the light. I could not tell if it was the wind or something else. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I grabbed the house phone. Yes, an actual landline, and kept it next to me. When the knocks started again, they were louder, faster. The kids upstairs began to stir. I heard Max's small voice call out, asking if everything was okay. I lied and told him it was just a neighbor. My voice must have sounded wrong because he came to the top of the stairs, clutching a blanket. I told him to stay with his sister, locked the kitchen door again, and turned the deadbolt twice. Then I checked the camera feed one more time. Patrick was back. His face was closer now, his expression flat, as if he were watching something beyond the lens. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, whispering the address while keeping my eyes on the screen. The dispatcher asked me if I was sure it was the homeowner. I said yes, absolutely sure. She told me officers were on their way and to stay inside. I remember feeling this strange mixture of relief and disbelief. I had seen his face earlier that evening when he hugged the kids goodbye. There was no mistaking him, but the man on that screen looked wrong somehow. The same features, same clothes, but a blankness in his eyes that I can't describe. The police took about 15 minutes to arrive, though it felt much longer. During that time, I kept every light in the house off and sat at the bottom of the stairs listening. I could hear something faint outside, footsteps crunching against the gravel, slow and uneven. Then the sound of a car door shutting somewhere nearby. I waited for a knock at the front door, but it never came. When red and blue lights finally flashed through the curtains, I ran to open the door before they even stepped out of the car. 2 officers searched the property while one stayed with me and the kids. They found footprints near the back porch, leading toward the woods that bordered the neighborhood. I remember one of them saying the prints matched heavy boots, not sneakers or dress shoes. When they ran Patrick's name through their system, the mood shifted instantly. One of the officers made a quick call and stepped outside. A few minutes later, he came back pale-faced and told me Patrick was confirmed to be in Portland. His body had been found in a motel parking lot earlier that evening. Erin returned the next morning in tears, escorted by detectives. The truth unfolded in fragments. Months of violence hidden behind closed doors, reports she never filed, neighbors who suspected but stayed quiet. Patrick had apparently left town 2 days earlier after a violent argument, but something or someone wearing his face came back that night. The officers never found any signs of forced entry, and the camera feed from that moment somehow vanished from the cloud storage before they could retrieve it. I quit babysitting after that. Aaron and the kids moved away not long later. Every once in a while, I'll see a man on the street with the same posture, the same way of standing perfectly still like Patrick did on that porch. And for a second, I feel that same pressure in my chest, like the air is too thick. I try not to think about what I saw on that screen, or who, if anyone, was actually standing outside that door. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive from Madison to Milwaukee usually takes about an hour and 20 minutes, but on Thanksgiving night, the empty interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the November moon. My graduation from nursing school in 2008 meant I'd been making this exact trip for over a decade now, always promising Mom I'd text when I got home safe. That night, stomach still full of turkey and green bean casserole, I had the heat cranked up and some true crime podcast playing through the speakers. The host was describing how predators often work in pairs when my headlights caught something moving near the tree line. At first I thought it was just a deer. Wisconsin has millions of them. But then I saw it was smaller, walking weird, favoring one side like it was hurt bad. I pulled over about 30 feet ahead of where I'd seen it, leaving the engine running because something deep in my gut told me to keep the car ready. When I cracked my door open, the dome light illuminated the shoulder, and there it was. This medium-sized dog, maybe 40 pounds, brown and white patches, dragging its back left leg. Poor thing looked like it had been clipped by a car. Not bad enough to be dying, but definitely needing help. The way it whimpered when it tried to walk made my nurse instincts kick in hard. I grabbed the blanket from my back seat, the one I keep for emergencies, thinking I could wrap it up and get it to the emergency vet clinic near my apartment. The dog stayed about 15 feet away, not running but not coming closer either, just standing there shaking in the cold Wisconsin air. That's when I heard the other car approaching behind me, which wasn't unusual, except it slowed down and stopped maybe 20 feet back. No headlights though, which struck me as strange because the highway was dark as hell that night, just their parking lights glowing amber. I figured maybe they saw my hazards and thought I needed help. Happens all the time on these rural stretches. But then, both doors opened at the exact same time, synchronized like they'd practiced it, and two people got out. In my side mirror, I could only make out their shapes against the faint light from their car interior before they shut the doors. One was definitely bigger, broader shoulders, and they both moved with this purposeful walk that made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. "Buster, there you are, buddy," the smaller one called out, voice carrying clear in the still night air. But something about the tone was all wrong, too rehearsed like reading from a script. The dog didn't react at all. Didn't turn its head, didn't wag its tail, nothing. Just kept looking at me with those pain-filled eyes. The bigger one started making kissing sounds, the kind you'd make to call your pet, but he was walking toward my car, not toward the dog. My hand was still on the door handle, half in and half out of the driver's seat, when the smaller one said something that made my whole body go rigid. "Ma'am, could you help us grab him? He doesn't trust strangers, but if you're already out of your car." The dog was between us and them, but neither of them was looking at it. They were both looking at me. Every self-defense class I'd ever taken, every warning my dad had drilled into me since I was 16, it all crystallized in that moment. I yanked my leg back into the car so fast I knocked my knee against the steering column, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. The bigger one broke into a run the second my door closed, and I mean full sprint, covering the distance to my car in seconds. His fist hit my window hard enough that I thought it might crack, and his face pressed against the glass, mouth moving, saying something I couldn't hear over my own screaming. My transmission was still in park, and my fingers felt thick and clumsy as I fumbled for the gear shift. The smaller one had circled around to the passenger side, trying the handle, then pounding on that window too, and between their bodies blocking my mirrors, I couldn't see anything behind me to reverse safely. The dog just stood there through all of this, hadn't moved an inch despite the chaos, and that detail hit me even through my panic. A real injured dog would have bolted or at least reacted to two people running and yelling. I threw the car in drive instead of reverse, flooring it forward, tires squealing on the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, illuminated red by my taillights, I saw them running back to their car, and that's when I noticed they'd left both doors open the whole time, ready for a quick pursuit. My speedometer hit 80 before I even realized it, taking the curves of that dark highway way too fast. But I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a gas station about 3 miles ahead. My phone was in the cup holder and I grabbed it at a red light, calling 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. The operator kept me on the line while I pulled into the gas station, parking right in front of the doors where the cameras and lights were. I gave her the mile marker, described the car as best I could. Dark sedan, maybe a Chrysler or Dodge, no front plate that I could see. The two people, one about 6 feet, heavy build, wearing what looked like a baseball cap, the other shorter, thinner, both in dark clothes. While I was talking, a highway patrol officer arrived at the gas station, apparently already in the area, and he took my full statement right there in the parking lot. He radioed for another unit to check that stretch of highway, then looked me straight in the eye and said something that made me want to throw up. "You did the right thing driving off." We've had 2 reports this month of a similar setup. Same area, fake injured animal near the forest. What really got me was when he asked about the dog's behavior, nodding when I described how it didn't react to them calling it or to the commotion. "Probably trained for this," he said, explaining that some people teach dogs to limp on command, reward them for staying still no matter what's happening around them. The thought of someone taking what could have been a sweet family pet and turning it into bait for God knows what made me sick. Another officer called in about 20 minutes later, said they'd found fresh tire marks where I'd described but no sign of the car or the dog. They increased patrols in that area for weeks afterward, but as far as I know, they never caught them. The officer gave me his card, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if I felt unsafe, and suggested I vary my routes home for a while. I didn't sleep that night, or the next 3 nights actually, just kept replaying every second in my mind. The way they moved in perfect coordination, how the smaller one's voice had this fake concerned quality, like someone who'd practiced the line too many times. I started researching similar incidents online and found a rabbit hole of forum posts from truckers and late-night drivers across the Midwest. Same pattern in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, always rural highways, always between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., always targeting women driving alone. Some posts described different bait scenarios, a person flagging for help whose partner hides in the ditch, abandoned baby carriers on the shoulder that are empty when you get close, even fake accident scenes. The consensus was that these operations usually involve human trafficking rings, targeting isolated victims on empty stretches where screams won't be heard and witnesses are non-existent. My mom called the next morning, casual as always, asking if I'd gotten home safe like she always did after family dinners. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what happened, just said yes, traffic was light, everything was fine. But I've told pretty much everyone else, especially women who drive alone, because that's the thing that haunts me most. If I hadn't kept my engine running, if I'd walked those extra 15 feet toward that dog, if I'd been just a little more trusting or a little less paranoid, I would have been another missing person case. They would have found my car on the side of the highway, door open, hazards still blinking, and no trace of where I'd gone. My family would have spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened between Madison and Milwaukee on a cold Thanksgiving night. The detective who followed up a week later told me something that explained why they probably chose that specific spot. The forest there connects to a maze of old logging roads, unmapped paths that lead deep into wilderness where nobody goes in winter. Perfect for moving vehicles unseen, for transferring victims, for making people disappear. He also mentioned that the timing wasn't random. Holiday nights when police are dealing with drunk drivers and domestic calls, when response times to rural areas are slowest. These people had clearly done their homework, studied patterns, knew exactly when and where to set their trap. The fake limp was probably practiced hundreds of times. The dog conditioned with treats and praise until it could hold that injured pose no matter what chaos erupted around it. I still drive that route to visit my parents, though now I take the longer way through town after dark, adding 20 minutes but buying peace of mind. Sometimes I wonder about that dog, whether it was stolen from someone's yard, purchased from a sketchy breeder, or raised from birth for this specific purpose. I wonder if those two people are still out there, maybe in another state now, setting up on some other dark highway with their well-trained decoy. But mostly I think about the women who might have stopped before me, the ones who didn't keep their engines running, who trusted their compassion over their instincts, the ones whose families are still searching, still hoping, still checking their phones for a text that says, "Made it home safe." Denver gets quiet when it snows, and that November night was no exception as I walked Cooper through the empty streets near my apartment. My boots crunched against the fresh powder while Cooper, my golden retriever mix, pulled against his leash, nose buried in every interesting smell along Colfax Avenue. I'd moved into the second-floor unit 6 months earlier, right after signing the divorce papers that officially made me single again at 29. The building was one of those converted Victorians from the 1920s, complete with rattling radiators and floors that announced every footstep, but Cooper and I had made it home. That night started like any other. I'd gotten back from my warehouse shift around 9, found Cooper doing his desperate bathroom dance by the door, and bundled up for our usual evening routine. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and thick snowflakes drifted down steadily, muffling the few sounds of passing cars and turning Denver into something from a snow globe. We made our way past the dumpsters behind the building, Cooper taking his time despite my constant shivering, and I remember noticing how untouched everything looked, like nature had thrown a white blanket over the whole neighborhood. After Cooper finished marking his usual spots, we circled back to the front entrance, passing the old fire escape that clung to the side of our building like a skeleton. Snow had accumulated on every step and platform, creating perfect, undisturbed layers that must have been building up for hours. Something caught my eye as I glanced up at my living room window on the second floor. The curtains I always kept closed were parted slightly in the middle, creating a narrow gap where warm light spilled out into the darkness. Strange, I thought, but figured the old radiator must have kicked on and created enough air movement to shift the fabric. Cooper raced up the interior stairwell ahead of me, leaving wet paw prints on the threadbare carpet, while I trudged behind him, feeling every hour of my shift in my lower back. As we approached apartment 2B, I could hear my TV through the door, but something was different about the sound. I distinctly remembered leaving it on ESPN for the Lakers game, but now I was hearing what sounded like a weather report, that droning meteorologist voice talking about storm systems and weekend forecasts. I unlocked the door and Cooper burst inside, immediately heading for his water bowl in the kitchen while I stood in the doorway, staring at the TV. The local news was on, showing some reporter standing in the snow downtown. But I knew for certain I'd been watching basketball before we left. The remote sat on the coffee table exactly where I'd left it, and for a second I wondered if maybe the cable had glitched or the game had ended early. I kicked off my wet boots, hung Cooper's leash on the hook, and walked over to grab the remote, switching back to ESPN where the game was still going, fourth quarter with 5 minutes left. My apartment wasn't much, just a basic one-bedroom with a living room that opened to a tiny kitchen. But I'd gotten used to every sound it made, every way the floorboards creaked, and something felt different that night. The air seemed warmer than it should have been, like the heat had been running longer than the 20 minutes we'd been gone. And there was this smell I couldn't quite place, something like wet wool mixed with stale cigarette smoke. Cooper had finished drinking and was now sniffing around near the coat closet by the front door, his tail low and his body tense in that way dogs get when they sense something wrong. I walked over to pull him away, figuring maybe a mouse had gotten in through the walls again when I heard it. A cough. Not loud, kind of muffled and quick, like someone trying to hold it in, and it came from inside the closet. Every muscle in my body locked up, that primitive freeze response when your brain realizes danger before you fully process what's happening. Cooper started growling, this low rumble I'd never heard from him before, his fur standing up along his spine as he faced the closet door. The blood was pounding so hard in my ears I could barely think straight, but I managed to grab Cooper's collar and slowly back toward my bedroom, trying to remember if I'd left my phone in there or if it was still in my jacket pocket. The closet door was one of those old accordion-style ones that never quite closed right, and through the gap at the bottom, I could see the shadow of feet. Work boots, from what I could tell, sized way bigger than mine, with snow still melting off them, creating small puddles on my hardwood floor. My brain went into this weird overdrive mode, simultaneously screaming at me to run, while also cataloging stupid details like how those puddles were going to warp the wood if they sat there too long. Cooper's growling got louder, more aggressive, and whoever was in that closet shifted their weight, making the door rattle slightly on its track. I kept backing up, pulling Cooper with me, when my hip hit the corner of the kitchen counter and knocked over the ceramic bowl where I kept my keys, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence, and immediately I heard movement from the closet, fast and deliberate, like someone preparing to come out. Without thinking, I yanked Cooper into my bedroom and slammed the door, turning the pathetic little push-button lock that wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely pull my phone from my jacket pocket, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial 911. While the phone rang, I pressed my ear against the bedroom door and heard heavy footsteps moving through my apartment, not trying to be quiet anymore, just walking around like they owned the place. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered as clearly as I could that someone had broken into my apartment and was still there, giving my address on Colfax Avenue twice because I was so panicked I wasn't sure if I was making sense. She told me units were on the way, to stay where I was, stay on the line, but all I could focus on was the sound of my kitchen drawers being opened, the metallic sliding noise they made, and knowing exactly which drawer held my kitchen knives. The footsteps moved from the kitchen toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, slow and deliberate, and I could hear this raspy breathing that wasn't mine or Cooper's. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed, a leftover from my softball league days, and positioned myself between Cooper and the door, trying to control my own breathing so I could hear better. The dispatcher kept asking me questions, but I could barely process them, just kept whispering that he was getting closer. Please hurry, he's right outside my door now. Then the footsteps stopped, and for maybe 10 seconds that felt like hours. There was complete silence except for Cooper's low, continuous growl, and my heart hammering against my ribs. The doorknob rattled just once, a testing kind of turn to see if it was locked, and then I heard him laugh, this quiet, raspy chuckle that made my whole body go cold. Not angry or frustrated, just amused, like this was all some kind of game to him. I heard him walk back down the hallway, and then came sounds I'll never forget. My couch cushions being moved, papers rustling, drawers opening and closing in my living room desk. He was searching for something, or maybe just going through my things because he could, because he'd been in my space while I was gone, and now felt entitled to it. The dispatcher said police were 3 minutes out, but 3 minutes feels like a lifetime when there's only a thin door and a useless lock between you and someone who broke into your home. Through the bedroom window, I could see the snow still falling steadily, the fire escape outside covered in white, just like I'd seen it from the ground, except now I realized those perfect, undisturbed layers I'd noticed earlier had been a lie. He must have brushed the snow back into place after climbing up, covering his tracks, which meant he'd put thought into this, planned it, watched me leave with Cooper before making his move. Suddenly, I heard sirens in the distance getting louder, and the sounds from my living room stopped immediately. Fast footsteps crossed my apartment, and I heard my front door slam open so hard it hit the wall. I stayed frozen in place, bat still raised, Cooper pressed against my legs, listening to those heavy boots running down the interior stairs. The dispatcher was saying something, but I couldn't focus on her words. Just waited until the sirens were right outside my building before I finally unlocked my bedroom door with shaking fingers. My apartment looked like a tornado had gone through it. Every drawer pulled out, cushions thrown around, papers scattered across the floor. The closet door hung open, and inside I could see where he'd pushed aside my coats to hide, the hangers still swaying slightly. There were wet boot prints everywhere, leading from the window to the closet, then throughout my apartment, and finally out the front door that still stood wide open. 2 cops showed up first, both younger guys who seemed almost as nervous as I was, followed by an older detective who took one look at the scene and immediately called for the crime scene unit. They found where he'd jimmied my living room window from the fire escape, the lock completely broken, wood splintered around the frame. The detective, a woman named Reeves who had this calming way of talking, explained that there'd been a string of similar break-ins in the neighborhood, always during snowstorms when footprints would be covered quickly, always targeting second-floor apartments with fire escape access. What made me different, she said, was that I'd come home while he was still there. The others had been out for hours, returning to find their places ransacked. They collected fingerprints from the window frame and closet door, took photos of the boot prints before they dried completely, and had me walk through to see if anything was missing. My laptop was still there, my TV, even the cash I'd left on my dresser, which made everything worse somehow, knowing he wasn't after my things but something else, maybe just the thrill of being in someone else's space. Detective Reeves found something I hadn't noticed in my panic, a half-eaten sandwich on my kitchen counter, made with my bread, my turkey, my mustard, with a bite taken out of it like he'd been having a casual lunch. Next to it was an open beer from my fridge, mostly empty, condensation still beading on the bottle. The violation of it hit me harder than the ransacked drawers. This person had made themselves at home, eaten my food, drank my beer, probably sat on my couch and watched my TV while I was walking Cooper in the snow. She bagged everything for evidence and mentioned they'd found similar scenes at other break-ins. The intruder always helping himself to food, always leaving that signature half-eaten meal behind like some kind of calling card. Cooper hadn't left my side since the police arrived, pressing against my legs whenever anyone moved too suddenly, and I knew he'd sensed the danger before I had, tried to warn me with his body language that something was wrong with that closet. They caught him 5 days later, trying the same thing 3 blocks away at another Victorian conversion. The homeowner had installed a security camera after hearing about the break-ins, and it caught him clear as day, climbing the fire escape during another snowstorm. Gregory Watts was his name, 43 years old, had been living in his car since getting evicted 6 months earlier. Detective Reeves called to tell me they'd found items from all the break-ins in his car, including a notebook where he'd written down addresses, schedules, details about the residents. My entry was there. 2B Colfax, single male, dog, walks 9:30 p.m. most nights, works late shift. He'd been watching us for weeks, learning our routine, waiting for the perfect snowy night. The court gave him 18 months and I got a victim notification letter saying he'd be eligible for parole in 9. I moved out the next month, found a place on the ground floor with better locks and no fire escape, though Cooper and I still do our evening walks. But even now, whenever it snows, whenever I come back to find something slightly out of place, a curtain shifted, or a cushion moved, I think about that cough from the closet and check every door, every window, every hiding spot before I can breathe normally again. The week after Halloween always feels strange in our neighborhood. like the whole street is recovering from a sugar hangover, and that Monday in 2018 was no different. I'd just gotten my daughter Chloe to bed around 8:30, which was a miracle considering she was still wired from all the leftover candy I'd stupidly let her have after dinner. Being 33 with a 6-year-old meant most of my evenings looked exactly like this one. Kitchen cleanup, lunch prep for tomorrow, and if I was lucky, maybe 45 minutes of whatever show I was binging before passing out on the couch. We lived in this little ranch-style house just outside Jefferson City. Nothing fancy, but it had a good school district and a big backyard where Chloe could play. The divorce had been finalized that spring, and honestly, those first few months of just the two of us had been harder than I'd expected. But by November, we'd found our rhythm. Around 9:30, right as I was folding the last of Chloe's school uniforms, the doorbell rang. Now, nobody ever came to our door that late on a Monday, especially not in early November when it got dark by 6 and the temperature dropped into the 40s. Through the peephole, I could see two figures in dark hoodies standing on my porch, both probably teenagers from their height and build, though I couldn't make out their faces with the hoods up. They were whispering to each other and giggling, that nervous kind of laugh kids do when they're pulling a prank. I figured they were doing some late trick-or-treating dare, or maybe had lost a bet with their friends. Without opening the door, I flicked the porch light on and off twice, my universal signal for nobody's buying what you're selling, and watched through the side window as they looked at each other, laughed harder, then jogged down my driveway and disappeared into the darkness of the street. I went back to the laundry, but something kept nagging at me about the whole thing. Maybe it was how they'd stood there. Not quite right. Like when you see someone in a play trying too hard to act natural. The taller one had kept his head tilted down the entire time, and the shorter one's giggle had this weird rhythm to it, almost mechanical, like he was forcing it out at regular intervals. But I brushed it off because, honestly, teenagers are weird, and after teaching 3rd grade for 5 years before having Chloe, I'd seen kids do stranger things for attention. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, checked that the front door was locked, twice actually, and settled into the living room with my laptop to finish some lesson plans for my online tutoring students. 10 minutes later, I heard it. A soft tapping on glass, deliberate and spaced out perfectly. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. The sound was coming from the back of the house, from the sliding glass door that opened onto our deck. My whole body went rigid in that awful way where you want to move but can't quite get your muscles to cooperate. The tapping continued, patient and steady, and I could picture someone standing out there in the darkness of my backyard, knuckles against the glass, waiting. The motion sensor light back there had been broken since September. I'd been meaning to fix it but kept putting it off, so whoever was out there was doing this in complete darkness. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, staying low, keeping away from the direct line of sight to that glass door. From where I crouched behind the kitchen island, I could barely make out a shape through the glass door, just a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the yard beyond. It wasn't moving, just standing there, one arm raised like it was about to knock again. The figure seemed taller than I remembered either of those kids being, but maybe it was just the angle, or maybe one was standing on my deck furniture. I dialed 911 but didn't hit call yet. What would I even say? That someone knocked on my door and now they're in my backyard. The tapping started again, but this time it was different, lower on the door, like whoever was out there had knelt down or bent over. Then I heard something that made my chest tighten. The subtle rattle of the door handle being tested, gentle at first, then a bit more insistent when it didn't budge. My phone screen lit up my face in the darkness, and I swear the silhouette outside shifted, like it had noticed the glow. I held my breath and watched as the shape moved sideways along the glass, disappearing from view, and for maybe 20 seconds, there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then came a scraping sound from the other side of the house, metal on wood, and I realized with horrible clarity what was happening. They were checking the windows. The scraping moved from the guest bedroom window to the bathroom, getting closer to Chloe's room. That broke my paralysis completely. I hit call on 911 and stood up, not caring anymore if they saw me because nobody was getting near my daughter's window, not while I was conscious and breathing. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I whispered as clearly as I could that someone was trying to break into my house, gave her my address, and told her my 6-year-old was asleep in her room. She kept me on the line, saying units were on their way, maybe 5 minutes out, and to stay away from windows and doors. But I was already moving down the hallway toward Chloe's room, phone pressed to my ear, when I heard something that stopped me cold. Laughter from outside her window, that same mechanical giggling from earlier, but now it was accompanied by a second voice, deeper, definitely adult, muttering something I couldn't make out. Through the thin curtains of Chloe's room, I could see the shadows of 2 figures right outside, and one of them was doing something to the window screen, pulling at the corner where it met the frame. I burst into Chloe's room and scooped her up while she was still half asleep, blanket and all, and carried her into my bedroom closet on the opposite side of the house. She mumbled something about a bad dream, and I whispered that we were playing a hiding game, that she needed to be super quiet like when we play hide and seek. My beautiful, trusting daughter just nodded against my shoulder and closed her eyes again. The dispatcher was still talking, but I could barely focus on her words because now I could hear them at the front door again. Not knocking this time, but doing something to the lock. A metallic scratching sound that went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then suddenly silence. Complete, total silence. Even the dispatcher seemed to sense it because she stopped asking questions and just said, "Officers are 2 minutes out. Stay where you are." We sat in that closet, Chloe breathing softly against my neck, me trying not to hyperventilate, surrounded by the smell of my winter coats and old shoes. Then I heard something that to this day makes me nauseous when I think about it. Footsteps on the roof. Slow, careful footsteps directly above us, moving from the edge toward the center of the house. Our attic access was in the hallway ceiling, just a simple pull-down panel with a folding ladder, and I'd never even thought to check if it locked from the inside. The footsteps stopped right about where that panel would be, and I heard a creaking sound, the kind old wood makes when weight shifts on it. The dispatcher must have heard my breathing change because she whispered that officers were pulling onto my street now, 30 seconds away. The sirens came before the footsteps could move again, and immediately the sounds on the roof turned into scrambling, running, like squirrels but heavier, moving fast toward the back of the house. I heard a thump that must have been someone jumping down, maybe onto the deck, and then nothing. The dispatcher told me to stay put until the officers cleared the scene, and I held Chloe tighter, feeling her little heartbeat against mine. When the police finally gave the all clear and I carried Chloe back to her bed, she was completely asleep, unaware of how close we'd come to something terrible. The officers found footprints in the flower bed below her window. The screen had been cut with what looked like a box cutter, and there were scratch marks on the front door lock, like someone had tried to pick it with amateur tools. But here's the part that still keeps me up at night. The reason I'm sharing this story now, years later, after we've moved to a different state entirely. The next morning, one of the officers came back with a detective, and they asked to see my security camera footage. I'd forgotten about the camera completely. My ex had installed this cheap wireless one by the front door the previous year, and honestly, I rarely checked it. We pulled up the app on my phone and scrolled back to the night before, and what we saw made the detective immediately call for additional units. The first person at my door, the shorter one I'd thought was a teenager, was wearing what looked like a rubber Halloween mask, one of those old man ones with wrinkled skin and wispy gray hair. But it was the taller figure that made everyone in the room go quiet. It was definitely an adult man, probably in his 40s, wearing a teenager's face mask, the kind that just covers the front of your face with elastic bands. The video showed him pulling something from his pocket while the other one rang the doorbell. It was a roll of duct tape. The detective told me they'd been tracking similar attempts in 3 other neighborhoods around Jefferson City that week, always targeting single mothers. always using the same method of sending the masked decoy to the front while the man tried to find another way in. They caught them 2 days later trying the same thing at a house in Fulton, about 20 miles away. The man turned out to be a registered sex offender from Arkansas who'd been violating his parole, and his accomplice was his 19-year-old nephew who he'd convinced to help him. When they searched the man's van, they found zip ties, tape, rope, and a journal with addresses and notes about the routines of different women and their children. My address was in there, along with notes about what time I usually turned off the lights when I left for work, and that I had a young daughter who went to Riverside Elementary. They'd been watching us for at least 2 weeks before that night. I testified at the trial, and he got 25 years. We moved the following summer, and even now, whenever someone knocks on my door after dark, even when I'm expecting them, I check every window and door twice before I go to bed. November always felt heavy in our town, like the air itself was tired from holding up all that gray sky. I'd just turned 17 that September, same week I got my learner's permit, and everything about that fall felt like waiting for something to start. My best friends Garrett and Jenna lived on the same cul-de-sac as me, had since we were in elementary school, and we did everything together. That Saturday night, first weekend of November, the Andersons down on Birchwood were throwing their annual post-Halloween bonfire, the one where everyone brought their leftover candy, and Mr. Anderson told the same ghost stories he'd been telling since we were kids. We went every year, mostly for the tradition now, watching the younger kids jump at the scary parts while we roasted marshmallows and talked about college applications. The fire was dying down around 11 when we decided to walk home, taking the long way through the neighborhood, because none of us wanted the night to end yet. The streets were empty except for a few porch lights and the occasional jack-o'-lantern still glowing on someone's steps, most of them already soft and caving in on themselves. Garrett was doing his terrible impression of Mr. Anderson's voice, making Jenna laugh so hard she had to stop walking, and I remember thinking how perfect everything felt, how these were the moments I'd miss next year when we were all at different schools. We were about 4 blocks from the bonfire when I noticed the van for the first time, this dingy white panel van with rust eating through the wheel wells, crawling along behind us maybe 50 feet back. The weird thing was how it would slow down every time we passed under a streetlight, like the driver was trying to get a better look at us, then speed up slightly in the dark patches between. Garrett was still goofing around, hadn't noticed anything, but Jenna caught my eye and I could tell she'd seen it too. The way her shoulders got tight and she moved a little closer to us. Tried to keep my voice casual when I suggested we cut through the park, thinking maybe the van was just heading the same direction by coincidence. But when we turned onto Sycamore, the van turned too, keeping that same creepy distance. The engine made this low rumbling sound, not quite healthy, like something was loose under the hood, and I could hear it getting louder and softer as the driver played with the gas pedal. Jenna grabbed my arm then, her fingers digging in through my jacket, and whispered that we should call someone. But who were we going to call? Our parents would freak out, maybe ground us for walking home so late, and we weren't even sure if anything was really wrong yet. The van had tinted windows in the back, completely dark, and the front windshield reflected the streetlights in a way that made it impossible to see who was driving. Garrett finally caught on that something was happening, stopped his joking mid-sentence when he turned and saw the van rolling along behind us. No headlights on now, just these dim orange running lights that made it look like some kind of predator with glowing eyes. We started walking faster without really discussing it, our sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk in this awkward rhythm as we tried not to run but couldn't help speeding up. The van sped up too, engine growling louder, and then did something that made my whole body go rigid with fear. It pulled ahead of us suddenly, maybe 100 feet, and turned into a driveway on the right side of the street, killing all its lights completely. The house it had pulled into was dark, no cars in the driveway except for the van now, and I knew the family that lived there, the Carters, had gone to Florida for a week because their daughter was in my chemistry class, and she'd been complaining about missing the bonfire. The van just sat there in the shadows next to their garage, engine ticking as it cooled, waiting for us to walk past. We stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk, the three of us breathing hard even though we hadn't been running yet, and I could hear Jenna's teeth chattering even though it wasn't that cold. Garrett suggested we cross the street and go back the way we came, but before we could move, the van's reverse lights flashed on, these harsh white rectangles in the darkness, and it started backing out of the driveway, slow and deliberate. The driver had turned the engine back on but kept the headlights off, and the van was rolling backward down the street toward us, weaving slightly like the driver was watching us in the side mirror instead of looking where they were going. That's when we ran, all three of us at the same time, no discussion needed, just pure instinct taking over. We cut hard left through someone's yard, my foot catching on a garden hose and nearly sending me face first into their lawn gnome collection, Jenna pulling me up by my elbow as we scrambled between two houses. Behind us, I could hear the van's engine roar as it accelerated, tires squealing as it tried to turn around in the narrow street, and then the sound of a car door slamming that sent ice through my veins. We burst into the backyard of a house I didn't recognize, motion sensor floods blazing to life and lighting us up like we were on stage, and Garrett was already pulling out his phone, his hands fumbling with the passcode. The backyard connected to another street through a gap in the fence, and we squeezed through, splinters from the old wood catching on our clothes, ripping Jenna's jacket sleeve. I could taste copper in my mouth from running so hard, and my legs felt disconnected from my body, like they belonged to someone else who just happened to be carrying me along. We were on Oakmont now, at least 6 blocks from where the van had been, and Garrett finally got through to 911, practically shouting our location into the phone while we crouched behind someone's SUV. The operator kept asking him to slow down, to explain what was happening, but how could we explain something that sounded so paranoid when you said it out loud? A van was following us. The driver turned around to chase us. We were hiding now behind a random car, praying the van wouldn't cruise down this street next. The police showed up faster than I expected, 2 cruisers with their lights on but no sirens, and the officers separated us to get our stories while we stood there in the middle of Oakmont, looking like we'd been through a hurricane. My officer, this older guy with a thick gray mustache who introduced himself as Officer Brennan, actually believed us right away, didn't give us any grief about being out late or suggest we were imagining things. He radioed the description of the van to other units, then drove us around the neighborhood in the back of his cruiser, asking us to point out exactly where everything had happened. When we got to the Carter house where the van had pulled in, there were fresh tire marks in the driveway, deep grooves in the gravel where it had reversed hard, and Officer Brennan took photos with his phone, measured the wheelbase with a tape measure from his trunk. He said something into his radio about checking camera footage from the ATM at the bank on Sycamore, which would have captured any vehicle passing that intersection. About an hour later, while we were sitting in the police station waiting for our parents and drinking hot chocolate that tasted like chalk, Officer Brennan came back with this expression on his face that made my chest tighten all over again. They'd found the van, he said, abandoned in the parking lot of Westfield Middle School, still warm, driver's door hanging open. The weird part was what they found inside. 3 rolls of duct tape, a box of zip ties, and a notebook with addresses written in it, including several houses in our neighborhood with the days and times written next to them. The Carter house was on the list with "out of town" written beside it, and there were notes about 3 targets, with descriptions that matched me, Garrett, and Jenna pretty well, down to Jenna's purple backpack and Garrett's varsity jacket. The van had been reported stolen from a plumbing company 2 towns over 3 days earlier, and they never found who'd been driving it that night, despite pulling prints and checking every security camera they could find. Our parents went into full protective mode after that, driving us everywhere for weeks, installing new security systems, organizing neighborhood watch meetings that packed the community center. The detective assigned to our case, a woman named Diane Lawson who wore these thick-rimmed glasses and always had a coffee stain somewhere on her shirt, told us we'd likely been watched for days, maybe weeks, that whoever was in that van had been planning something specific. She showed us footage from the bank ATM that caught the van passing by earlier that evening, before the bonfire even started, just circling the neighborhood in slow loops. You could make out a figure in the driver's seat, baseball cap pulled low, but the quality was too grainy to get any real details. The notebook had our routines written down: when we walked to school, when we stayed after for clubs, when we typically hung out at the park on weekends, and Detective Lawson said we were lucky we'd varied our pattern that night by going to the bonfire. The middle school where they found the van had security cameras too, but whoever ditched it there knew exactly where the blind spots were, parking in the one corner where 3 broken cameras created a perfect dead zone. The only glimpse they got was a figure in dark clothes walking quickly away from the van, heading toward the tree line at the back of the school property. And by the time the K-9 unit arrived, the trail had gone cold at the creek that ran behind the playground. What haunted me most were the small details the detective mentioned almost offhandedly. Fresh scratches on the inside of the van's rear doors, like someone had been testing the locks from inside, and a receipt from a hardware store dated that morning for the zip ties and tape, paid in cash at a store 40 miles away. Whoever it was had driven 40 miles just to buy those supplies where no one would recognize them, then driven back to hunt us. For weeks after that night, every white van made me stop breathing for a second. Every stranger who looked at us a beat too long made my skin prickle with that same fear. Jenna started carrying pepper spray and taking a different route home every day, never the same pattern twice, and Garrett's older brother started picking him up from school in his pickup truck, wouldn't let him walk anywhere alone. The police increased patrols in our neighborhood, and for about a month there was always a cruiser parked near the school, or doing slow loops through our streets. But eventually, things went back to normal, at least on the surface. Detective Lawson called us in December to say they'd connected our case to 2 similar incidents in neighboring counties. Same pattern with the white van and the notebook. But those kids hadn't been as lucky as us, hadn't run fast enough, though she wouldn't give us details about what had happened to them. The case never got solved, at least not while we were still in high school, and by the time I left for college the following year, it had become just another unsolved mystery in the filing cabinets at the police station. Sometimes I Google it, looking for updates or similar cases, wondering if whoever was in that van that night ever got caught somewhere else, but I never find anything definitive. What I can't forget is that moment when the van reversed toward us in the dark, how deliberate it was, how patient they'd been watching us for weeks, learning our habits and waiting for the perfect opportunity. Jenna, Garrett, and I are still close, even though we're spread across different states now. And every November when we text each other around the anniversary, none of us mentions it directly, but we all know what we're really checking on, making sure we're all still okay, still here, still running faster than whatever was chasing us that night. Snow was coming to Plattsburgh that Monday, and I could smell it in the air when I stepped onto my porch with my morning coffee. After 26 years of marriage to Nathan, I'd gotten pretty good at reading warning signs, though apparently not good enough to avoid the October divorce that left me starting over in a duplex that smelled like old wood and whatever the previous tenant had been cooking for the past decade. Frank, my elderly landlord who lived in the other half, had promised quick maintenance response times, which mattered since teaching 7th grade. Math didn't leave me much energy for home repairs. The place had its charm, though, with original hardwood floors and tall windows that actually opened, unlike the sealed disasters in most modern apartments. I'd been there exactly 9 days, still discovering which floorboards creaked and which light switches controlled what. That morning started like the others since I'd moved in, except for the weather forecast promising 6 to 8 inches by nightfall. I stood in my living room, watching the sky turn that sick yellow color that precedes every upstate storm, when I heard this weird scraping noise from below. Real faint, almost like fingernails on concrete, but steady and deliberate. I got down on the floor, pressed my ear against the cold wood and listened. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, paused, then started again. The heating had just kicked on, so I figured it was probably the old pipes doing their thing, or maybe Frank was organizing something in our shared basement. He'd mentioned he kept holiday decorations down there. I finished my coffee, grabbed my stack of ungraded tests, and drove to school through streets that were already emptying out in anticipation of the storm. School let out early at 1:30 because of the weather, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, thick flakes were already coating everything. Frank's car was gone, which wasn't unusual since he mentioned he spent Mondays at his daughter's place in Malone, about an hour west. I brought in an armload of firewood from the covered pile out back, thinking I'd grade papers by the fireplace and enjoy my first real snow day in the new place. But when I walked through the front door, I noticed something immediately wrong. My living room rug, this cheap burgundy thing I'd bought at Target the previous week, was pushed up at one corner, like someone had tripped over it. I specifically remembered straightening it that morning after catching my toe on the edge, and there was this smell, really subtle but definitely there, like unwashed clothes mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The scraping sound started again while I was standing there with my arms full of firewood, and this time it was louder, more insistent. It was definitely coming from directly beneath the living room, right under where I was standing. I dropped the wood on the couch and went to the basement door in the kitchen, flipping on the light switch at the top of the stairs. The single bulb down there barely illuminated anything beyond the wooden steps. I called out, asking if Frank was down there, even though I knew his car was gone. No response, but the scraping stopped immediately, like whatever was making the noise had heard me. I stood there at the top of those stairs for probably a full minute, listening to nothing but my own breathing and the tick of snow hitting the kitchen windows. Every instinct told me not to go down there alone, but I kept thinking about how Frank would react if I called him at his daughter's house over what was probably just a raccoon or some pipes that needed adjusting. I grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer and made my way down, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a house this old. Stone foundation walls, exposed ceiling joists covered in cobwebs, and that damp earth smell that never quite goes away. Frank's half was sectioned off with a piece of plywood, and there were a few cardboard boxes labeled Xmas and Easter stacked against the divider. My side was mostly empty except for the furnace, water heater, and some old shelving units the previous tenant had left behind. I swept the flashlight beam across the floor, looking for any signs of animals or water damage that might explain the noise. That's when I noticed the coal chute door in the far corner, something I hadn't even known existed until that moment. These old houses used to get coal deliveries straight into the basement, and most people just sealed them up decades ago when they converted to gas or oil heat. But this one wasn't sealed anymore. The metal door, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, was hanging open about 6 inches, and there were fresh scratch marks on the concrete floor, leading from it toward the center of the basement. I walked closer, my flashlight beam shaking slightly, and that's when the smell hit me full force. Body odor, stale food, and something sickly sweet like overripe fruit. I pulled the door open wider and aimed my light inside. There was a blue sleeping bag, one of those cheap Coleman ones you can get at any sporting goods store, spread out in the crawl space beyond the chute. Empty Chef Boyardee cans were stacked neatly against one wall, along with water bottles, some still half full. But the thing that made my chest go tight was the phone charger plugged into my outlet, the cord snaking back through the opening to a spot I couldn't see. Someone had been living in my basement, probably had been there before I even moved in, and they were still coming and going through that old coal chute that opened up near the bushes on the side of my house. I backed away from the coal chute so fast I knocked over one of the empty shelving units, the metal crash echoing through the basement. My phone was upstairs, and suddenly that seemed like the stupidest thing in the world, coming down here without it. Turned to run back up the stairs and saw something that made me stop cold. There were footprints in the dust on the concrete floor, fresh ones that weren't mine, leading from the coal chute to the stairs. Not just one set either, but multiple tracks going back and forth, some of them made by bare feet. The most recent ones still sharp and clear in the dust, went right up to the basement door I'd just come through. This person, whoever they were, had been walking through my kitchen, my living room, probably standing right behind me while I slept on the couch that first week after moving in, too exhausted to make it to my bedroom. I ran up those stairs faster than I'd moved in years, slammed the basement door behind me, and dragged a kitchen chair under the doorknob. My phone was on the counter, and I called 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. While I waited for the police, I stood at my front window watching the snow pile up, wondering if whoever had been living beneath my floors was out there somewhere, watching me back. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking me questions I could barely answer because I kept thinking about all those nights I'd heard the house settling, all those mornings I'd found things slightly out of place and blamed my post-divorce brain fog. The woman on the phone kept telling me to stay calm, that officers were on their way, but the snow was coming down harder now and I knew the roads would slow them down. 20 minutes, she said, maybe 30 with the weather. I moved every piece of furniture I could lift in front of the basement door, creating a barricade that would at least make noise if someone tried to come through. The wait felt like hours, but it was probably only 15 minutes before I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The scraping sound again, but this time it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from outside, near the living room window, like metal against wood. I crept to the window, staying low, and peeked through the blinds. There was a man out there, skinny and hunched over, wearing a filthy green army jacket that was way too big for him. He had stringy gray hair that hung past his shoulders, and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. He was using something, maybe a screwdriver or a knife, trying to pry open my window from the outside. The snow was coming down so thick I could barely make out his features, but I could see his lips moving like he was talking to himself, and his breath came out in quick white puffs that disappeared into the storm. When he looked up, maybe sensing me watching, his eyes met mine through the gap in the blinds, and they were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white, like a husky dog's eyes. He didn't run when he saw me. He just stood there, still gripping whatever tool he'd been using, snow accumulating on his shoulders and in his tangled hair. Then he smiled, not a normal smile, but something that showed too many teeth, yellowed and broken, and he pressed his face right up against the glass. I could see dirt caked under his fingernails as he tapped on the window, 3 soft knocks like he was visiting a friend. The dispatcher was asking what was happening, but I couldn't form words. The man outside tilted his head, studying me like I was something fascinating he'd discovered, and then he spoke loud enough for me to hear through the glass. He said my name, my actual first name, clear as day. Not yelling, not threatening, just conversational, like we were old acquaintances. He knew who I was. He'd probably gone through my mail, my papers, everything I'd thrown away since moving in. He knew my schedule, when I left for work, when I came home. He'd been living underneath me, learning me, and now with the police still minutes away and the snow creating a white wall around my house, he wanted me to know that he knew. I screamed at him to get away, that the police were coming, and that seemed to amuse him because he actually laughed. This wet, rattling sound that I could hear even through the window. Then he held up something in his other hand, and it took me a second to realize what it was. My spare house key, the one I'd hidden under a decorative rock by the back door my second day there. He dangled it between his thumb and finger, making sure I could see it clearly through the falling snow, and then he walked away from the window, disappearing around the corner of the house. The dispatcher was practically yelling at me now, telling me to get to a room with a lock to barricade myself in, but all I could think about was that he had a key, had probably always had it, and every night I'd locked my doors thinking I was safe. He could have walked right in whenever he wanted. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and shoved my dresser in front of it, the wood scraping across the floor just like the sound I'd been hearing from the basement. I could hear him now, the front door opening. Not forced, not broken, just the normal sound of a key turning in a lock and the door swinging open on its hinges. His footsteps were slow and deliberate on the hardwood, and he was humming something, some tune I didn't recognize. The dispatcher said the police were 3 minutes out, maybe less, but I could hear him in my kitchen now, opening drawers, looking for something. Then the footsteps came toward the bedroom, and he knocked on the door, polite as could be, and asked if I wanted to talk about the rent. The rent, like he owned the place, like I was the intruder. He said Frank had promised him he could stay, that they had an arrangement, that I wasn't supposed to be here yet. His voice was calm, reasonable even, which made it so much worse. He said he'd been waiting for the right time to introduce himself, that he didn't mean to scare me, that we could share the space if I wanted. The dresser shook as he tested the door, and I could see the wood starting to splinter near the lock. Then the sirens cut through everything, that beautiful wailing sound getting louder every second. The pressure on my bedroom door stopped immediately, and I heard his footsteps retreat fast across the living room. The front door slammed, and through my bedroom window I watched him sprint through the snow toward the tree line behind the house, that oversized army jacket flapping behind him like wings. The police found me still barricaded in my bedroom, and it took 3 officers to convince me it was safe to move the dresser. They searched the basement, documented everything. The sleeping bag, the food, a notebook filled with observations about my daily routine written in pencil, even sketches of me sleeping on the couch. They found where he'd been getting in and out through the coal chute, the outside opening hidden behind an overgrown juniper bush that Frank apparently hadn't trimmed in years. The man's name was Howard Pelletier, a local who'd been in and out of psychiatric facilities for decades. Frank's nephew recognized him from the description and said Howard used to do odd jobs for Frank years ago, back before his mental health completely deteriorated. They never caught him that night. The snow covered his tracks within an hour, and he knew those woods better than anyone. But they boarded up the coal chute, changed all my locks, and a patrol car sat outside my duplex for the next 3 nights. I moved out the following week, stayed with my sister in Albany until I found a new place, this time a modern apartment on the 3rd floor with proper locks and a security system. Frank tried to keep my security deposit, said I broke the lease, but I had a lawyer friend write him a letter that changed his mind real quick. I heard from another teacher months later that Howard turned up at a homeless shelter in Burlington when the weather got bad in January. The police arrested him there, and he went back to a psychiatric facility, though for how long I never found out. I still teach at the same school, still grade papers in the evening, but now I live in a place where every sound has an explanation, where footsteps belong to neighbors I know by name, and where the only thing under my floor is another apartment with a young couple who play their music too loud on weekends. And that's fine by me. The cold had teeth that November night in Alaska, the kind that bites through 3 layers of clothing and makes your bones ache. I'd been hauling frozen seafood from Anchorage down to Fairbanks for about 6 years by then, enough runs to know every pothole and curve on the park's highway. My rig, a beat-up Peterbilt that had seen better days sometime during the Clinton administration, was parked at a pull-off near mile marker 147, one of those spots truckers use when the official rest areas are full or too far away. The heater was running on low, just enough to keep the frost from forming inside the windshield, and I'd wedged myself into the sleeper cab with my usual setup. Sleeping bag rated for -40, wool socks doubled up, and my phone charging on the little shelf I'd installed myself. Outside, the darkness was absolute, that special kind of black you only get when you're 50 miles from the nearest town, and the clouds are covering whatever stars might be brave enough to shine. I remember checking my watch right before falling asleep, one of those habits you develop when your life revolves around delivery schedules and hours of service regulations. The green digits showed 9:47 p.m., which meant I could get a solid 6 hours before I needed to start rolling again to make my morning drop-off. The last thing I heard was the tick-tick-tick of the engine cooling down, metal contracting in the cold, a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Sleep came easy that night, the exhaustion of 14 hours on icy roads pulling me under like quicksand. I'd parked here probably 30 times before, always the same spot where the ground was level enough that I wouldn't wake up with a crick in my neck from sleeping at an angle. Other truckers knew about this place too, but tonight I was alone, just my rig and the occasional groan of wind pushing against the trailer. The knocking started at 1:14 a.m. according to that same watch when I jolted awake. 3 measured raps on the driver's side window, not frantic but deliberate, like someone calmly trying to get your attention at a store counter. My first thought was another trucker, maybe somebody who'd blown a tire or needed jumper cables. Happens more than you'd think out here. I sat up in the dark, my breath fogging in the cold air, and fumbled for the little LED flashlight I keep velcroed to the wall. The knocking came again, same pattern. 3 steady knocks that echoed hollow against the glass. Through the sleeper cab's small window, I could barely make out a shape standing beside my door, just a dark outline against the darker night. The person stepped back when they saw me moving, giving me room to climb forward into the driver's seat. When I clicked on the flashlight and aimed it through the window, the beam lit up a man's face that I'll never forget, not because it was scary or deformed or anything like that, but because it was so perfectly ordinary except for one detail. He was sweating. Here was this guy, standing in -20 weather, wearing just a flannel shirt and jeans. No coat, no gloves, and there were actual beads of sweat running down his forehead. He had sandy hair cut short, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven. The kind of face you'd see at any hardware store or gas station and forget 5 minutes later. But that sweat, it was wrong, like seeing someone sunbathing in a blizzard. He smiled when the light hit him, raised his hand in a little wave, and mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass. I cracked the window maybe 2 inches, keeping my hand on the gear shift out of habit, ready to fire up the engine if needed. "Hey there, friend," he said, and his voice was steady, casual, like we were meeting at a barbecue instead of a frozen pull-off in the middle of nowhere. "Sorry to wake you, but my car died about a quarter-mile back, just around that curve. Battery's fine, engine turns over, but she won't catch. Think it might be the fuel line freezing up. Happens all the time up here, right?" He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and I watched the sweat immediately freeze into tiny crystals on his skin. "I was wondering if you could help me push it, get it rolling downhill a bit. Sometimes that's all it takes to get the fuel flowing again. 2 strong guys like us shouldn't take more than 5 minutes." His eyes never left mine the whole time he talked, not blinking much, just steady eye contact that felt rehearsed somehow. The thing about truckers is we help each other out. It's an unwritten rule of the road. I've changed more tires and given more jump starts than I can count, pulled guys out of ditches, shared food when somebody's broke down waiting for a tow. But every instinct I developed in 20 years of driving was screaming at me that something was wrong with this picture. Beyond the sweat, beyond the lack of winter clothes, there was the timing. He said his car was a quarter-mile back, but I'd been asleep for over 3 hours and hadn't heard any vehicle pass by. And trust me, you hear everything in a quiet night like that. The gravel crunches, the engine noise carries, especially around curves where people tap their brakes. Plus, if his car really wouldn't start, how was pushing it going to help with a frozen fuel line? That's not how engines work, and anybody who drives in Alaska knows that. "Where's your coat?" I asked through the crack in the window, watching my breath turn to ice crystals in the air between us. The question seemed to catch him off guard for just a second, his smile flickering like a TV losing signal, before coming back full strength. "Left it in the car," he said, laughing a little. "Stupid, I know, but I was so frustrated when she died that I just started walking. Figured I'd find help quick. Been walking for maybe 20 minutes now, worked up quite a sweat actually. Come on, man. I'm freezing out here despite how it looks. My wife's gonna kill me if I don't make it home tonight. Got my daughter's recital tomorrow. She's playing violin, first chair." He pulled out a wallet, started showing me a photo through the window. But in the dark, with just my flashlight, all I could see was the reflection on the plastic sleeve. I kept the window cracked, but didn't move to open the door, and I could see his patience starting to wear thin, though he tried to hide it. His jaw muscles tightened just a bit, and he shifted his weight from foot to foot, not like someone cold, but like someone getting ready for something. "Tell you what," I said, trying to sound helpful. Let me call you a tow truck. I've got good cell signal here. And there's a 24-hour service out of Cantwell. They could be here in maybe an hour. I reached for my phone, making a show of it, but kept my eyes on him. That's when his whole demeanor changed, like dropping a mask. The friendly smile disappeared, replaced by something flat and calculating. "No need for that," he said, his voice different now, lower, more insistent. "Just need you to step out for 5 minutes. Your truck will be fine, I promise. Just need some help pushing, that's all." That's when I saw it, just a glimpse in my side mirror, movement behind my trailer, maybe 30 feet back. Another person trying to stay in the shadows, moving slowly along the passenger side of my rig. The man at my window must have seen my eyes flick to the mirror because he immediately knocked harder, trying to get my attention back. "Hey, come on, buddy, don't leave me hanging here. Alaska rules, right? We help each other out." His hand went to his pocket, and I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. I cranked the engine, and the Peterbilt roared to life, diesel smoke billowing black in the cold air. The man jumped back from the door, and in my passenger mirror, I saw the second person sprint away from my truck, heading for the tree line. I slammed the truck into gear and hit the air release, the brakes hissing like angry snakes. The man was shouting something now, but I couldn't hear it over the engine noise, didn't want to hear it. As I pulled out, my headlights swept across the pull-off, and that's when I saw their vehicle, tucked behind a cluster of spruce trees where I hadn't noticed it before. A dark pickup truck with the engine running, exhaust visible in the cold. A third person sitting in the driver's seat. No broken down car, no mechanical trouble, just 3 people who'd been waiting in the dark for someone to stop. I gunned it onto the highway, checking my mirrors constantly for the next 10 miles, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My CB radio was crackling with static, and with shaking fingers, I switched to Channel 19, the trucker's channel, to warn anyone else who might be heading that way. The chatter on the CB that night is what really made everything sink in. About 40 minutes after I'd gotten back on the road, still jumpy at every set of headlights in my mirrors, I heard another driver, handle was Kodiak Bear, talking about something that happened at the Broad Pass rest area, maybe 15 miles from where I'd been parked. A driver had stopped to use the facilities, left his rig running like we all do in winter to keep the diesel from gelling, came back to find 2 men inside his cab. They'd beaten him pretty bad when he tried to stop them, left him on the ground with a concussion and broken ribs while they took off with his truck and $50,000 worth of electronics he'd been hauling to Fairbanks. The state troopers found the truck 6 hours later, abandoned and stripped clean off a logging road. Kodiak Bear said the driver was lucky to be alive, that the temperature had dropped to -30 that night, and if another trucker hadn't found him 20 minutes later, he would have frozen to death right there in that rest area parking lot. I made my delivery in Fairbanks the next morning, barely slept for the next 3 nights, kept seeing that sweating face at my window every time I closed my eyes. Filed a report with the troopers, described everything I could remember, but they said, without a license plate or better description of the vehicle, there wasn't much they could do. The officer I talked to, a woman who'd been working the highways for 15 years, told me I'd probably saved my own life by trusting my instincts. She said these kinds of setups were getting more common, groups targeting long-haul truckers because we often carry valuable cargo and always have diesel fuel, which sells good on the black market. The sweat on that man's face still bothers me when I think about it, and I finally figured out why he was sweating in that cold. Adrenaline, pure and simple. He was pumped up for violence, ready to do whatever it took to get me out of that cab. Now I sleep with a crowbar next to my bed in the sleeper, and I never crack my window for anyone at night, no matter how legitimate their story sounds. That pull-off at mile marker 147 is still there, but I never stop at it anymore. I'd rather drive an extra hour tired than park in that particular darkness again. The break had been long overdue. Weeks of back-to-back meetings, constant messages, and the kind of exhaustion that makes every day blur together had started to eat away at me. When an ad for a digital detox retreat appeared on my laptop screen late one night, the idea sounded perfect. A quiet lodge tucked somewhere in the Oregon countryside. No screens, no distractions, just time to recharge. The price was low enough to make me wonder if it was some new wellness startup trying to build a reputation, but I booked it anyway. I needed silence more than I needed logic. The drive there took most of a gray November afternoon. The roads grew narrower and lonelier the farther I went, the trees swallowing what little sunlight there was. The sign for Airvale Lodge looked almost handmade, nailed to a crooked wooden post by the side of the road. When I finally pulled into the gravel lot, my phone had no signal. I took it as a good sign, a forced break from everything. The main building looked rustic, a wide porch lined with mismatched rocking chairs, and a carved wooden door that groaned when it opened. A woman in a beige uniform greeted me inside. Her voice was gentle but rehearsed, every word precise. She asked for my name, then reached out her hand and said they'd be holding on to all electronic devices for the duration of the program. Before I could protest, another staff member appeared with a tray lined with numbered envelopes. My phone went into one, sealed with a sticker that read "Serenity requires surrender." They gave me a cotton uniform and a name tag. My own name printed in bold black letters. "Participants blend better that way," the woman said with a kind of warmth that didn't invite questions. Dinner that night felt strange. Everyone wore the same pale clothes, moving quietly around the long wooden tables. No one seemed to know each other, but they acted like they did. Smiling, nodding, serving food in synchronized rhythm. The staff stood along the walls, watching, never eating. When I tried to make small talk with the woman sitting beside me, she simply said, "It's easier if you let go of words." I laughed awkwardly, thinking it was part of the retreat's minimalist philosophy, but something about her expression stayed with me through the night. The next morning began with a bell that rang through the halls at dawn. Everyone lined up in the courtyard like students waiting for roll call. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the mist hung low between the trees surrounding the property. A man who introduced himself only as Guy Thomas gave a short speech about releasing digital toxins and rediscovering natural rhythm. His tone was calm, but every sentence carried the kind of certainty that made me uneasy. When I asked how long the program lasted, he smiled without answering. "You will know when it ends," he said, as if it were something obvious. The day unfolded with scheduled silence and strange rituals. We had to walk in single file along forest trails, pause at marked stones, and write affirmations on paper that were later burned in a communal fire pit. Meals were timed to the minute. Every clock in the lodge showed the same hour, even though the sunlight shifted throughout the day. When I asked another participant how long she'd been there, she looked around before whispering. I stopped counting after the third sunrise. Her eyes darted to the nearest staff member. Then she smiled tightly, like she regretted saying it. By the afternoon, the sense of calm that the staff tried to impose had started to crack. I noticed people pacing near the windows or staring too long at the locked gate beyond the main courtyard. I decided to test it myself during a meditation session when everyone's eyes were closed. The gravel path leading to the exit was longer than it looked, and my steps sounded louder than they should have. When I reached the gate, a heavy chain looped through its bars. A padlock the size of my hand hung in the middle. Through the metal, I could see the empty road stretching into the trees. No cars, no signs of movement, only silence so deep it felt staged. That evening, I went to the front desk and asked for my phone. The receptionist, a young man with perfect posture and a voice too calm, checked a list behind the counter. "You signed the agreement," he said, not even looking at me. "You're here until the program ends." I asked again, louder this time, and he repeated the same line word for word as if rehearsed. A couple of staff members appeared behind him, blocking the hallway. Their faces were blank, but their stance wasn't. That was the moment I realized no one here was simply following wellness routines. They were following orders. That night, I barely slept. The lodge walls seemed thinner, the quiet heavier. From my room window, I could see the courtyard dimly lit by lanterns, shadows moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Around midnight, a low hum echoed through the trees, not an engine or generator, but a rhythmic pulse that grew louder every few seconds. When I opened my door to listen, 2 staff members were standing at the end of the hallway, facing me. Neither spoke, but one raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. I shut the door and pressed my back against it, heart pounding in my chest. The following morning, the woman I'd spoken to at dinner was gone. Her bed was neatly made, her name tag missing from the wall hook. When I asked one of the cleaners where she'd gone, she replied, she completed her process. That phrase circulated throughout the day like a chant, whispered during meals, murmured by staff, written on the whiteboard in the hall. Completion is peace. By then, I understood that no one here was trying to rest or heal. They were being reshaped into something obedient. I decided to escape that night. During the final group meditation, I hid one of the metal utensils from the dining table under my sleeve. When the lights dimmed, I slipped out through a service corridor that smelled of bleach and wet wood. The kitchen door opened to the back of the property, near the same gate I'd tried before. Using the fork, I wedged the chain loose enough to slip it free of the latch. My fingers were raw, the sound of metal scraping metal slicing through the still air. For a second, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran. The road beyond the gate stretched into the forest. No lights, no signs, just endless darkness. I walked for what felt like hours until a delivery truck appeared in the distance. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, slowed down when he saw me. I told him I'd been hiking and got lost. He didn't ask questions. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police. They said there was no record of a place called Airvale Lodge anywhere in the county, and no retreat registered under that name. I have searched for it online since then, and the website that first drew me in no longer exists. I still have the name tag they gave me. Plain white plastic, my name printed in black letters. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, trying to remember the faces of the people still inside those walls. I never saw them again, but sometimes late at night, I hear that same low hum from the woods behind my apartment. The coast feels different once the tourists are gone. The air turns sharp, the sand loses its warmth, and the ocean seems louder, as if it is reclaiming the silence. I had taken a last-minute freelance gig, planning to spend a quiet November in a small beach house outside a fishing village in Maine. The owner's photos showed weathered shingles, pale blue shutters, and a wraparound porch that faced the sea. It looked like the kind of place where time slowed down, exactly what I needed to finish a photo series before the snow came. The house itself stood a few miles from town, down a narrow road lined with pines. The front steps creaked under my boots as I carried my gear inside. It smelled faintly of salt and old books, the kind of musty comfort that hinted at years of damp air. The layout was simple. Kitchen and living room downstairs, 2 bedrooms on the main floor, and a staircase that ended at a locked door labeled storage only. The host had mentioned that the upper floor wasn't in use, so I didn't think much about it then. That first day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon walking along the dunes, catching the late sunlight breaking through thick clouds. When night came, the wind began to howl through the cracks in the window frames. The house groaned and shifted with every gust, but there was something peaceful about it. I made tea, edited a few photos, and fell asleep on the couch with the faint hiss of the ocean outside the window. Sometime in the middle of the night, a sound woke me. It was steady and rhythmic, not the wind, not the surf. Footsteps. Light but deliberate, pacing directly above me. I sat up, the couch springs creaking beneath me, and listened. The steps moved slowly from one end of the ceiling to the other, then stopped. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe pipes, maybe the house settling, but then a faint tune drifted through the air. Music. Something old, scratchy, like a record playing from another room. I turned off the lamp and held my breath, trying to locate the source of the sound. The melody had a strange quality, a waltz maybe, though the notes seemed warped and distant, like it was being played from behind thick walls. I checked the time. It was close to 3 in the morning. I finally grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs. Each step made the old boards groan under my weight. When I reached the door, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the dark around me. I tried the handle. It did not budge. Locked. From the inside. I knocked softly, half expecting someone to answer, half hoping no one would. Nothing. My pulse hammered in my ears as I pressed my ear to the wood. Faint shuffling, a drag of movement like someone turning in place. Then, a single thump against the door. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance on the steps. For a moment, I stood there frozen in disbelief, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Eventually, I forced myself back downstairs, locked my bedroom door, and waited for daylight. The morning light made everything seem harmless again. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I had probably been dreaming. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I walked around the outside of the house, camera in hand, tracing the roofline. The upper floor windows were there all right, 3 of them, boarded up, paint peeling away in uneven strips. No lights, no movement. Just the wind rattling the loose boards. I snapped a few photos more out of habit than intention, and went back inside to make coffee. When I messaged the host, I kept it polite. I asked if anyone might have been doing maintenance upstairs, mentioning the music. The reply came quickly. The house doesn't have an upstairs anymore. It was destroyed in a fire years ago. I stared at the screen, rereading it. I could still hear the footsteps in my head, the pattern of them, deliberate and human. I wanted to argue, to ask for proof, but something about the certainty in their message stopped me. Instead, I typed a short thank you and set the phone face down on the counter. That evening, I avoided going near the stairs. I cooked dinner with the radio on just to drown out the creaks of the house. Around midnight, the wind picked up again, carrying the smell of seaweed and smoke through a gap in the window frame. I sat in the living room, scrolling through my camera roll, when something caught my attention. One of the exterior shots I had taken that morning. In the reflection of an upstairs window, behind the warped glass, there was a faint outline of a person. The shape was blurred, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been standing there, watching. Sleep was impossible after that. I kept the lights on and stayed by the window until dawn. The next morning, I decided to check the attic space from the outside again. The boards over the windows looked undisturbed, but when I touched the edges, flakes of charcoal rubbed off on my fingers. Beneath the wood, the smell of burnt plaster seeped out, faint but distinct. I followed the scent around the back of the house and found a small hatch hidden under the eaves, sealed with rusted nails. It looked like no one had touched it in years. I packed my things that afternoon, told the host I had a family emergency, and left before the sky darkened. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The upstairs windows were still boarded, but for a moment I could swear one of the boards shifted slightly, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peer through. I didn't stop to look again. I reached the main road and kept driving until the ocean was only a whisper behind me. Weeks later, when I developed the last roll of film, one photo came out that I didn't remember taking. It was the interior of a narrow hallway, wood-paneled, scorched at the edges, and at the far end, a gramophone stood in perfect condition, the needle resting on a spinning record. I still do not know how it appeared among my shots, but I boxed up that film and never touched it again. Sometimes, when the wind is high, I can still hear that same warped waltz playing in my head.